Welcome to NightSleepWhisper, the most peaceful corner of the dark. I am your voice for tonight, and tonight I speak to you from the mysterious carriages of the Silver Arrow. In this 50-chapter marathon, every word will bring you closer to a deeper sleep. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and explore this mystery with me. Henry stood on the station platform. The evening air was cold and thin. He pulled his heavy wool coat tighter around his body. In front of him sat the Silver Arrow. It was the most beautiful train he had ever seen. Its metal sides shone under the bright station lights. The train looked like a long, sleeping snake waiting to move through the dark mountains. Henry was a successful architect. He spent his days looking at blue paper and tall buildings in the city. He was tired. He needed this trip. He wanted to see the quiet trees and the white snow of the north. He held his leather suitcase tightly in his right hand. His ticket was in his left pocket. A man in a dark blue uniform stood near the door of the first carriage. This was Mr. Vance, the conductor. His hat was perfectly straight. His white gloves were very clean. He did not smile when Henry walked toward him. "Good evening, sir," Mr. Vance said. His voice was as cold as the wind. "May I see your ticket?" Henry handed the small piece of paper to the man. Mr. Vance looked at it for a long time. He checked the date and the cabin number. Finally, he handed it back. "Cabin 3. First class," Mr. Vance said. He pointed toward the door. "Please enter. We leave in 5 minutes." Henry climbed the metal steps. Inside, the train smelled of old wood and expensive perfume. The carpet was a deep red color, and it felt soft under his shoes. He walked down the narrow hallway. The walls were made of dark, polished oak. Small golden lamps hung from the ceiling. They cast a warm, yellow glow on the doors. He found the door with the number 3 on it. He opened it and stepped inside. The cabin was small but very comfortable. There was a large, soft chair by the window and a bed with silk sheets. A small table sat in the corner with a bottle of water and a clean glass. Henry put his suitcase on the floor. He sat down in the chair and looked out the window. On the platform, people were saying goodbye. They were waving their hands and hugging. Henry did not have anyone to say goodbye to. He was a lonely man, but he liked the peace. Suddenly, the floor began to shake gently. A deep vibration traveled through the walls of the train. The heavy engine started to move. A large cloud of white steam rose past Henry's window, hiding the station for a moment. Slowly, the Silver Arrow began to roll forward. The lights of the station started to slide away. Henry watched as the city buildings became smaller and smaller. Soon, there were no more lights. There was only the dark forest and the rhythm of the wheels on the metal tracks. Henry felt a sense of excitement. He did not know that this journey would change his life forever. He did not know that the Silver Arrow was carrying more than just passengers. It was carrying a dark secret. Henry sat in his cabin for a while. He watched the dark trees pass by the window. The moon was high in the sky. It cast a silver light on the white snow outside. He felt hungry, so he decided to visit the dining car for a light meal. He stood up and straightened his suit jacket. He liked to look professional, even when he was traveling alone. He opened the heavy wooden door of his cabin. The hallway was empty and very quiet. The warm yellow lamps flickered as the train turned a sharp corner. Just as he stepped out, the door to the next cabin opened. A woman stepped into the hallway. She was wearing a beautiful green coat over a dark dress. Her black hair was tied back in a neat bun. She was very elegant, but she looked exhausted. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She held a small, black leather bag very tightly against her chest. She was trying to lock her door, but she was having trouble. Her hands were trembling. The small silver key slipped from her fingers. It fell onto the red carpet. Henry stepped forward and picked it up for her. "Here you go," Henry said gently. He handed her the key. The woman jumped. She pulled back as if she were afraid of him. Her eyes moved quickly from Henry's face to the ends of the hallway. She looked like a trapped animal. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I am Henry," he said, trying to sound friendly. "I am staying in cabin 3. It is right next to yours. If you need anything, please let me know." The woman looked at him for a long time. She seemed to be deciding if she could trust him. "I am Elena," she finally replied. "Are you traveling far, Elena?" Henry asked. She did not answer right away. She looked at the shadows on the wall. "Too far," she said. "The world is very big, but sometimes there is nowhere to hide." Henry felt a chill that was not from the cold air. "Hide? What do you mean?" Elena looked down the hallway again. A door opened at the far end, and a bright light spilled out. Elena flinched. She looked very nervous. "I must go inside," she said quickly. She took the key and pushed it into the lock. "Please, Henry, stay in your room tonight. Do not talk to anyone you do not know." Before Henry could ask another question, she went into cabin 4. She closed the door firmly. Henry heard the metallic sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. He stood alone in the hallway. The train moved smoothly, but Henry no longer felt peaceful. He felt like someone was watching him from the dark corners of the carriage. He looked at the door of cabin 4. It was completely silent. He decided to go to the dining car, but he walked much faster than before. Henry stood in the hallway for a long time. He looked at the wooden door of cabin 4. He wanted to walk away, but he felt very curious. Elena looked so scared. He wanted to help her. Suddenly, the door opened a small amount. Elena looked out again. She saw that Henry was still there. "Henry," she whispered. "Come inside. Quickly." Henry was surprised. He stepped into her cabin. It was exactly like his room, but it felt different. There was a heavy smell of expensive flowers and old paper. On the small table, there was a black leather bag. It was the same bag she held so tightly before. "I am sorry for my behavior," Elena said. She sat on the edge of her bed. "I am very nervous. This train is not a normal train. There are dangerous people here." Henry sat in the small chair. "Who is after you? Why are you afraid?" Elena touched the black bag. "Inside this bag, I have something very important. It is a secret document. If the wrong people find it, many people will be in trouble. It is a dangerous thing to carry." Henry looked at the bag. He was an architect. He built tall buildings and strong walls. He did not know about secrets or spies. "Why did you choose the Silver Arrow?" he asked. "I thought a luxury train would be safe," Elena explained. She looked at the window. The snow was falling faster now. "I thought I could hide among the rich passengers. But I was wrong. I think they know I am here. I saw a man watching me at the station. He had a scar on his hand." "Is it Mr. Vance?" Henry asked. He remembered the cold eyes of the conductor. "I do not know," Elena said. "But please, Henry, you must be careful. Because you talk to me, they might watch you too. Do not show anyone that you are my friend. Go to the dining car. Eat your dinner. Act like a normal passenger." Henry felt his heart beating faster. He was just a man on a vacation. Now, he was part of a mystery. "I want to help you," he said firmly. Elena smiled for the first time. It was a small, sad smile. You have a kind heart, Henry. But kindness can be a problem on this train. Take this. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. She put it in Henry's hand. It was a cold, metal whistle. If you are in trouble, or if you see something strange, use this, she said. But only if it is an emergency. Henry put the whistle in his pocket. He stood up to leave. I will go to the dining car now. I will see you tomorrow morning, Elena. I hope so, she said. Henry walked out of the cabin and closed the door. He felt the weight of the whistle in his pocket. He walked toward the dining car, but he felt like he was walking into a trap. Every shadow on the wall looked like a person. Every sound of the train made him jump. He needed to stay calm. He needed to be a normal passenger. Henry walked through 2 more carriages. The metal floors vibrated under his feet as the train moved fast. He reached the dining car and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The room was very bright and warm. It was filled with the quiet clink of silver forks hitting porcelain plates. There were many small tables with white tablecloths. On every table, there was a small lamp with a silk shade. The air smelled like roasted meat and expensive coffee. Henry found a small table near the window. A waiter in a white jacket came over immediately. He gave Henry a menu and a glass of water. Henry tried to look relaxed. He opened the menu, but he did not really look at the food. His mind was still in cabin 4 with Elena. He looked around the room at the other passengers. In the corner, an elderly man was reading a newspaper. Near the kitchen door, 2 women were talking in low voices. Henry looked for a man with a scar on his hand, but he did not see one. Everyone looked like a normal, wealthy passenger. He began to wonder if Elena was just very tired. Maybe she was imagining the danger. Suddenly, a shadow fell over his table. Henry looked up. It was Mr. Vance, the conductor. He stood very straight. His blue uniform was perfect. His hands were behind his back. He did not smile. His face was like a mask. Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Archer? Mr. Vance asked. His voice was flat and professional. Yes, thank you, Henry said. He tried to keep his voice steady. The train is very beautiful. Mr. Vance nodded slowly. His eyes were like 2 pieces of grey stone. They seemed to look right through Henry. The Silver Arrow is a special machine. It is very fast and very private. We like to keep our passengers happy, and we like to keep them safe. Henry took a sip of water. The cold liquid helped him feel better. That is good to hear. Mr. Vance leaned forward just a little. I noticed you were talking to the lady in cabin 4, Miss Elena. Henry felt his heart jump. He remembered Elena's warning. Yes, she had trouble with her door. I helped her with her key. I see, Mr. Vance said. He adjusted his white gloves. She is a very nervous traveler. Some people are not suited for long journeys. They imagine things. They see problems where there are none. It is best not to listen to stories on a train, Mr. Archer. They are often just fiction. I understand, Henry replied. Good, Mr. Vance said. He stepped back. Enjoy your dinner. The kitchen makes an excellent steak. I will be in the office if you need anything, but I suggest you go to sleep early. The mountains are very high, and the thin air can make people feel strange. Mr. Vance walked away. He moved silently down the aisle. Henry looked at his water glass. His hand was shaking. Mr. Vance was not just a conductor. He was a guard, and he was watching everything. Henry finished his meal quickly. The steak was excellent, as Mr. Vance had said, but Henry did not have an appetite. He felt the weight of the silver whistle in his pocket. It felt like a heavy stone. He stood up and paid his bill. The waiter took the money and gave a small, silent nod. His eyes were cold and did not meet Henry's gaze. Henry walked through the heavy glass doors of the dining car. The hallway was narrow and smelled of old floor wax. He felt the train begin to tilt. They were going up a steep mountain now. The engine was working harder, and the floor vibrated more than before. Outside, the moon was suddenly gone. A giant, dark shadow appeared ahead. It was the entrance to the Great North Tunnel. The train entered the tunnel. Suddenly, the world outside the window was completely black. Henry could only see his own reflection in the glass. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was carrying a heavy secret. The white snow and the silver trees were gone. There was only the thick, deep dark of the mountain. Inside the tunnel, the air changed. It felt heavy and cold. The lights from the small lamps in the hallway became weak. They started to flicker. One moment the hallway was bright yellow, and the next moment it was dark. Henry stopped walking. He held onto the wooden handrail to keep his balance. The sound of the train changed too. In the open air, the wheels were relatively quiet. Inside the narrow tunnel, the sound was much louder. The metal wheels made a constant, rhythmic noise against the tracks. The deep sound of the engine vibrated in Henry's chest. The stone walls of the tunnel were very close to the windows. It felt like the mountain was pressing against the train. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. Henry was in total darkness. He could not see his hands. He could not see the floor. He waited for the lights to come back, but they stayed dark. He stood perfectly still. He heard a door open somewhere behind him. A soft movement of air brushed against his face, like someone walking past him very quickly. "Who is there?" Henry asked. His voice sounded small and weak against the loud noise of the tunnel. No one answered. He reached into his pocket and touched the metal whistle. He remembered Elena's words. She told him to stay in his room. He felt a cold hand touch his shoulder for a very short second. He jumped back and hit his back against the wooden wall. His heart was beating like a drum. Then, the lights flickered and returned. The hallway was empty. There was no one behind him. There was no one in front of him. But the heavy door at the end of the carriage was swinging slowly back and forth. Henry did not wait. He ran toward his cabin. He did not look back. He needed to reach the safety of cabin 3. Henry reached his cabin door. His hands were shaking as he pushed his key into the lock. He finally opened the door and stepped inside. He leaned his back against the wood and breathed deeply. The room was quiet. The warm lamp was still glowing on the table. He felt a little safer, but his heart was still beating very fast. He thought about the cold hand on his shoulder in the dark tunnel. Who was it? Was it a person or just his imagination? He sat on his bed and tried to calm down. The train was still inside the long tunnel. The black walls of the mountain were still pressing against the windows. The rhythmic sound of the wheels was loud and constant. Suddenly, Henry heard a different sound. It did not come from the train or the tracks. It came from the wall. It came from cabin 4. Henry stood up and walked to the wall he shared with Elena. He put his ear against the dark wood. At first, he heard nothing. Then, he heard a muffled cry. It was a woman's voice. It sounded like Elena. She sounded surprised and very frightened. Then, Henry heard the sound of a heavy object hitting the floor. It was followed by the sound of feet moving quickly across the carpet. There was a brief struggle. He heard the sound of glass breaking. A lamp or a bottle had fallen. "No. Please," he heard Elena say. Her voice was thin and weak. Henry felt a wave of fear. Someone was in her room. Someone was hurting her. He remembered her pale face and her trembling hands. She was in danger, and he was the only person who knew. He ran to his door and opened it. The hallway was still empty. The lights were steady now, but the air felt very cold. He stood in front of Elena's door. He did not know what to do. He remembered the two large men in suits and the cold eyes of Mr. Vance. He was just an architect. He was not a hero. But he could not leave her alone. He raised his hand and knocked loudly on the door of cabin 4. "Elena. Are you okay? It is Henry," he shouted. The sounds inside the room stopped immediately. The silence was heavy and terrifying. Henry waited. He held his breath. He expected the door to open. He expected Elena to come out. But there was no movement. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time. "Elena. Answer me." Still, there was only silence. The train finally exited the tunnel. The silver moonlight returned to the hallway. The shadows became sharp and clear. Henry looked at the floor near the door. He did not see any blood, but he felt that something was very wrong. The silence inside the room was worse than the sounds of the struggle. He needed help. He needed to find the conductor. Henry stood in front of the door to cabin 4. His hand was still raised to knock again, but he stopped. The silence coming from inside the room was heavy. It was not a peaceful silence. It felt like the room was holding its breath. He tried the brass door handle. It was cold and did not move. The door was locked from the inside. "Elena," he whispered. He did not want to shout. He did not want to attract the attention of the two men in suits. "Elena, please answer me. I heard a noise. Are you hurt?" There was no sound. The only noise was the constant rhythm of the train wheels. The Silver Arrow was moving very fast now. The wind outside the windows made a long, low sound as it hit the glass. Henry felt a bead of sweat run down his face. He was cold, but his skin felt hot with anxiety. He looked up and down the hallway. To the left, the hallway led toward the dining car. To the right, it led toward the conductor's office and the front of the train. The hallway was a long, narrow tunnel of wood and carpet. The yellow lamps flickered again. For a second, the shadows on the floor looked like hands reaching for his feet. Henry decided he could not wait any longer. He had to do something. He could not break the door down. He was not a strong man. He needed a key. He needed Mr. Vance. He began to walk toward the front of the train. His footsteps were silent on the thick red carpet. He passed cabin 5 and cabin 6. The doors were all closed. He wondered if the other passengers were sleeping. How could they sleep while something terrible was happening? He reached a heavy metal door. This door was different from the cabin doors. It was painted a dark gray and had a small window made of thick glass. Above the door, a small sign said, "Conductor's Office, Private." Henry took a deep breath. He straightened his tie. He wanted to look calm, even though he felt like he was falling. He knocked on the metal door. The sound was sharp and loud. A moment later, he heard the sound of a lock turning. The door opened slowly. Mr. Vance stood there. He was still wearing his perfect blue uniform. He was holding a small gold pocket watch in his hand. He looked at Henry with his cold, grey eyes. He did not look surprised to see Henry in the middle of the night. "Mr. Archer," Mr. Vance said. His voice was very quiet. "It is very late. Why are you not in your bed?" "There is a problem," Henry said quickly. "In cabin 4. Miss Elena. I heard a struggle. I heard something break. Now she will not answer her door." Mr. Vance did not move. He did not look worried. He looked at his pocket watch and clicked it shut. A struggle. "Are you sure, Mr. Archer? Perhaps you heard the train crossing the mountain bridge. The sounds can be very strange at night." "No," Henry insisted. "It was a fight. I am sure of it. You must open the door. You have the master key." Mr. Vance stepped out of his office and closed the door behind him. He looked down the hallway toward Henry's cabin. "The lady in cabin 4 is a very private person," he said. "We do not open doors without a very good reason. It is against the rules of the Silver Arrow. A woman might be in danger." Henry shouted. He did not care about the rules. Mr. Vance sighed. It was a long, tired sound. "Fine. We will go and look. But if she is only sleeping, you will owe her a very big apology." Mr. Vance walked very slowly. He did not seem to be in a hurry. He adjusted his white gloves again and looked at the wooden walls of the hallway. Henry wanted to run, but he had to stay with the conductor. Each step felt like a minute. The train was still moving fast, and the rhythm of the wheels felt like a ticking clock in Henry's head. "Please, Mr. Vance, we must move faster," Henry said. His voice was filled with worry. "Patience is a virtue, Mr. Archer." Mr. Vance replied calmly. "On the Silver Arrow, we do things with order. If we run, we disturb the other guests. We do not want to wake the whole train because of a small noise, do we?" It was not a small noise. It was a fight. Henry insisted. He felt frustrated. Why was this man so calm? Did he not care about Elena? Or did he already know what happened? They passed the dining car. It was now dark and empty. The white tablecloths looked like ghosts in the dim light. They passed cabin 6 and cabin 5. Henry's heart was beating against his ribs. He looked at the floor, searching for any sign of trouble. But the red carpet hid everything. "You said you heard glass breaking?" Mr. Vance asked. He did not look at Henry. He looked straight ahead. "Yes." A loud crash. And then a muffled cry. Henry explained. "The mountains are full of ice this time of year," Mr. Vance said. "Sometimes, ice falls from the tunnel roof and hits the side of the train. It sounds exactly like breaking glass. And the wind can sound like a human voice. It is a common mistake for new travelers." "I know what I heard," Henry said firmly. He felt a sudden anger. He was not a child. He was a professional man. He knew the difference between the wind and a woman screaming for help. They finally arrived in front of cabin 4. The door was still closed. The hallway was silent. The small lamp outside the door was glowing with a weak, yellow light. Henry pointed at the door handle. "It is locked," Henry whispered. Mr. Vance stood in front of the door. He did not use his key yet. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times. The sound was polite and soft. "Miss Elena, this is the conductor. Are you awake?" There was no answer. Henry held his breath. He hoped to hear her voice. He hoped she would say she was fine. But the silence continued. "Miss Elena, I have a passenger here who is concerned about a noise," Mr. Vance said, a bit louder this time. Still, there was no sound from inside the room. Mr. Vance turned to Henry. His expression did not change. "You see, she is likely wearing earplugs. Many passengers use them to sleep through the noise of the engine." "No," Henry said. "Open it. Use the master key." Mr. Vance sighed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver chain. At the end of the chain was a long, thin key. He put the key into the lock. The sound of the metal turning was loud in the quiet hallway. Henry leaned forward, ready to see what was inside. The heavy door of cabin 4 swung open slowly. Henry held his breath. He expected to see a room in chaos. He expected to see Elena on the floor or the broken glass of a lamp. He was ready to help her or to fight. But as the warm light from the hallway spilled into the cabin, Henry stopped. He could not believe his eyes. The room was perfectly clean. The small bed was made with tight, white sheets. There were no wrinkles on the pillow. The small table in the corner was empty. There was no black leather bag. There was no smell of expensive flowers and old paper. The air in the room was cold and smelled only of cleaning soap. Henry stepped into the room. He walked to the center of the small carpet. He looked down at the floor near the bed where he had heard the struggle. There was no broken glass. There were no marks on the wood. He even looked under the bed, but he saw only the dark floor and a little bit of dust. "This is impossible," Henry whispered. He turned to look at Mr. Vance. "I was in this room 10 minutes ago. Elena was sitting right there, on the edge of the bed. We talked. She gave me something." Mr. Vance stood in the doorway. He did not enter the room. He looked at the empty cabin with a bored expression. He took a small notebook from his pocket and looked at a list of names. "Mr. Archer," the conductor said. His voice was very dry. "According to my passenger list, cabin 4 is empty. No one bought a ticket for this room. It was cleaned at the station and locked before we left." "That is a lie," Henry shouted. He felt a wave of heat in his face. "I saw her. She was wearing a green coat. She was nervous. She said she was carrying a secret document. We spoke for a long time." Mr. Vance sighed and stepped closer. He looked at Henry as if Henry were a child who was telling a ghost story. People often feel strange during long train journeys. "Mr. Archer, the altitude is very high. The air is thin. Sometimes, the mind plays tricks. You wanted to see someone, so you imagined her." "I did not imagine her." Henry reached into his pocket. He felt the cold metal of the silver whistle. He pulled it out and held it up for the conductor to see. "Look. She gave me this. She told me to use it if there was an emergency. If she is not real, where did this come from?" Mr. Vance looked at the whistle. He did not look surprised. He did not even blink. "It is a very nice whistle, sir. Perhaps you bought it at the station. Or perhaps you brought it from home. It does not prove a woman was in this room." Henry looked at the whistle in his hand. It felt very real. It was heavy and cold. But the room was so empty. It looked like no one had lived there for days. He felt a sudden, terrible doubt. Was he losing his mind? No. He remembered the smell of her perfume. He remembered her pale face. "Check the other cabins," Henry said. "She must be somewhere else on the train. It is after midnight. Mr. Archer." Mr. Vance said firmly, "I will not wake the other passengers. I suggest you go back to your room and sleep. If you continue to cause trouble, I will have to ask the guards to watch your door." Mr. Vance stepped out of the room and waited for Henry to follow. Henry walked out, his head spinning. The conductor locked the door of cabin 4 again. The click of the lock sounded like the end of a story. Henry stood in the hallway for a long time. The sound of Mr. Vance's footsteps slowly disappeared as the conductor walked toward the front of the train. The hallway was silent again, except for the constant, low rumble of the wheels. Henry looked at the wooden door of cabin 4. It looked so normal. It looked like it had never been opened. But Henry knew the truth. He looked at the silver whistle in his hand. It was cold and heavy. This was not a dream. He did not go back to his room yet. He felt a strong need to find proof. If Mr. Vance was lying, Then there must be something left behind. He knew that even the best cleaners make mistakes. He knelt down on the soft red carpet. He began to look at the floor very carefully. He crawled slowly on his hands and knees. He looked under the small ledge of the wall. He looked near the corners of the doors. The light from the ceiling lamps was weak, so he had to move his head close to the floor. The train shook as it moved over a bridge, but Henry did not stop. He was determined. Suddenly, he saw a tiny flash of light. It was near the bottom of the door frame of cabin 4. It was very small, like a spark from a fire. He reached out his finger and touched it. It was hard and metal. He picked it up and held it in his palm. It was a small gold earring. It was shaped like a tiny leaf, and it had a small, clear stone in the center. Henry remembered Elena's face. When she was talking to him earlier, he had noticed her jewelry. She was wearing these earrings. One of them must have fallen off during the struggle he heard earlier. The person who cleaned the room had missed it because it was tucked into the edge of the carpet. Henry felt a wave of relief, followed by a wave of cold fear. He was not losing his mind. Elena was real. She had been in that room. Someone had taken her, and someone had cleaned the room in just a few minutes. They were very fast and very organized. They had even changed the passenger list in the office. He stood up and put the earring in his pocket with the whistle. Now he had 2 pieces of proof. But who could he tell? He could not trust Mr. Vance. He could not trust the waiters. He was alone on a fast train in the middle of the mountains, surrounded by people who were lying to him. He walked back to his cabin, number 3. He locked his door and pushed the small, heavy chair in front of it. He sat on his bed and looked at the window. The snow was falling heavily now, hitting the glass with a soft, constant sound. The world outside was white and dark. Henry realized that he was in the middle of a very dangerous game. He did not know the rules, but he knew he could not sit still. He stayed awake, watching the door and waiting for the morning. The sun rose over the mountains. The light was very bright against the white snow. Henry did not sleep much. He spent the night sitting in the chair, watching the door. Every time the train moved or a floorboard made a sound, he jumped. When the morning light finally entered his cabin, he felt exhausted but ready to continue his search. He washed his face with cold water and went to the dining car. The dining car was different in the morning. It was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread. Most of the tables were full. People were talking and laughing. It looked like a normal, happy scene. But Henry knew better. He looked for a person he could talk to. He could not go back to Mr. Vance. He needed an ally. He noticed a woman sitting alone near the front of the car. She was wearing a heavy silk dress and a necklace made of large pearls. She looked very wealthy and very serious. This was Mrs. Thorne. She was eating a piece of toast and looking out the window with a sad expression. Henry decided to take a risk. He walked over to her table. "Excuse me, madam," he said politely. "Is this seat taken?" Mrs. Thorne looked up. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She looked at Henry's tired face and his wrinkled suit. She nodded slowly. "No, sir. Please, sit down." Henry sat across from her. A waiter brought him a cup of coffee. Henry waited for the waiter to leave. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "My name is Henry Archer," he said. "I am looking for someone. A woman named Elena. She was in cabin 4 last night." Mrs. Thorne stopped eating. She held her silver fork in the air for a moment. She looked around the room to see if anyone was listening. "I do not know any Elena," she said, but her voice was not steady. Henry reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small gold earring he found on the carpet. He placed it on the white tablecloth between them. The gold leaf shone in the morning sun. Mrs. Thorne gasped. She dropped her fork, and it made a sharp sound against the porcelain plate. She looked at the earring as if it were a dangerous insect. Her face, which was already pale, became as white as the snow outside. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. Her hands began to shake. "I found it near the door of cabin 4. Henry said. "I heard a struggle last night. Now the room is empty and the conductor says no one was there. Do you recognize it?" Mrs. Thorne did not answer immediately. She reached out and touched the earring with a trembling finger. "This belongs to a friend," she said softly. "A very dear friend. I told her the silver arrow was a mistake. I told her we were not safe here." She looked at Henry with eyes full of fear. "Put that away, Mr. Archer. If they see you with that, you will be the next person to disappear." Henry quickly put the gold earring back into his pocket. He felt his heart beating fast against his ribs. He looked at Mrs. Thorne. She was no longer eating her toast. She was staring at her hands. Her diamond rings were very bright in the morning sun, but her face was dark with worry. She looked much older than she had a few minutes ago. "You must be very careful, Mr. Archer," she said. Her voice was low and very serious. "The people on this train are not who they seem to be. For most passengers, this is a luxury holiday. But for a small group, it is a plan. A very dark plan." "Who are they?" Henry asked. He leaned closer to the table so no one else could hear him. "And what happened to Elena?" "I know she was in that room." Mrs. Thorne looked at the other tables. The waiter was coming back with a large pot of hot coffee. She waited until he filled Henry's cup and walked away again. The sound of the train wheels on the metal tracks was a constant, low roar that filled the car. "I cannot tell you everything," Mrs. Thorne whispered. "It is too dangerous for you to know. But I will tell you this. Elena is a very brave woman. She is a scientist, and she worked for the company that owns this train line. She discovered something terrible. The owners are using the silver arrow to move things that are not legal. They move secrets and stolen goods across the border because no one ever checks a luxury train." "The black bag," Henry said, remembering the bag Elena held so tightly. Mrs. Thorne nodded slowly. "Yes. The documents in that bag are the proof. They contain names, dates, and bank accounts. If those papers reach the city, very powerful people will go to prison. That is why Elena is missing. They finally caught her." Is she still alive?" Henry felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. "I think so," Mrs. Thorne said. She looked out at the snowy mountains. "They need a specific code to open the digital safe where the rest of the files are kept. Elena is the only one who knows it. Until they have that code, she is valuable to them. But they are searching for that bag. They did not find it when they took her from the room." Henry remembered the clean, empty cabin 4. "They cleaned the room to make me look crazy. Mr. Vance told me I imagined her. He tried to make me doubt my own eyes." "Mr. Vance is more than a conductor," Mrs. Thorne warned. "He is a guard. He is the one who makes people disappear and keeps the secrets hidden. And now he is watching you. Mr. Archer, you are a witness. In their world, a witness is a problem, and they are very good at solving problems." She reached into her small silk purse and took out a white cloth napkin. She took a small gold pen from her bag and wrote something quickly. She pushed the napkin toward Henry. "Do not read this here," she said. "Go to your room. Lock the door. Read it when you are alone. And please, do not talk to me again in public. On this train, friends are a danger to each other. We must act like strangers." She stood up. She did not look at him again. She walked away with her head held high. Henry watched her go. He felt the napkin in his hand. He finished his coffee, but he could not taste it. He was no longer just an architect on a trip. He was a man in a race for his life. Henry left the dining car immediately. He held the napkin tightly in his hand. He felt the eyes of the other passengers on his back. Every time a fork hit a plate, he flinched. He walked through the heavy doors and back into the narrow hallway of the sleeping carriages. The train was moving over a bumpy part of the track. He had to hold the handrail to stay steady. He reached the door of cabin 3. He stopped and looked at the handle. When he left for breakfast, he had locked the door. He also remembered leaving a small piece of thread on the handle. It was a trick he learned from an old movie. The thread was gone. His heart began to pound against his ribs. He put his key into the lock and turned it. He heard the metallic sound of the mechanism moving. He pushed the door open slowly. The cabin was a mess. His leather suitcase was lying open on the bed. His shirts, socks, and books were scattered everywhere. The small drawers under the bed were pulled out and left on the floor. Someone had even searched through the pockets of his extra coat. The intruder was looking for something specific. They were looking for the black bag that Elena mentioned. Henry stepped inside and closed the door. He checked the chair he had used to block the door last night. It had been moved back to the corner of the room. He felt a deep sense of anger. This was his private space, and someone had invaded it. But his anger was quickly replaced by fear. They knew he was involved now. They were looking for proof. He checked his own pockets. The silver whistle and the gold earring were still there. He had kept them with him, so the intruder did not find them. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the chaos. He realized that Mr. Vance or his men could come back at any moment. He remembered the napkin Mrs. Thorne gave him. He unfolded the white cloth with shaking fingers. The ink was dark and the handwriting was elegant but hurried. The note said, "They know you have the whistle. Do not go to the back of the train alone. Meet me in the library car at noon. Look for the book with the blue cover on the 3rd shelf. There is a map inside." Henry read the words twice. The library car was at the very end of the passenger section. It was usually empty during the day. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. He had 2 hours to wait. He began to clean up his room. He did not want the staff to see the mess. He folded his shirts and put them back into the suitcase. As he knelt down to pick up a book from the floor, he saw something near the leg of the bed. It was a small, rectangular piece of paper. It did not belong to him. He reached out and picked it up. It was a torn piece of a train ticket. It was not a normal ticket for a passenger. It was a special ticket for the staff of the Silver Arrow. On the back, there were 3 words written in pencil. "Dispose of her." Henry felt cold. The words were a death sentence. He realized that he was not just looking for a missing woman anymore. He was trying to stop a murder. Henry sat on the edge of the bed. He held the torn piece of the train ticket in his hand. The paper felt thick and expensive. On the front, there was a red stamp of the Silver Arrow. On the back, the words "dispose of her" were written in dark pencil. The handwriting was messy, but the message was very clear. It was a command. He looked at the ticket carefully. This was not a passenger ticket. Passenger tickets were blue. This ticket was bright yellow. He remembered seeing a similar yellow ticket in the pocket of the waiter earlier that morning. This meant the staff of the train were communicating with each other using these small notes. They were planning to get rid of Elena. Henry felt a cold sweat on his forehead. He was an architect. He built things. He did not know how to fight or how to hide from criminals. He was trapped on a fast-moving train in a foreign country. He looked at the window. The snowy mountains were beautiful, but they felt like the walls of a prison. He realized he could not keep these items in the open. If the intruder came back, they would find the whistle, the earring, and the ticket. He needed a good hiding place. He looked around the small cabin. He looked at the lamp, the chair, and the small table. Then, he noticed the floor. In the corner of the room, near the heater, there was a small gap in the wooden floorboards. He knelt down and used his pen to lift the edge of the board. It was a tiny space, but it was deep enough. He took the silver whistle, the gold earring, and the torn ticket. He wrapped them in his handkerchief and pushed them into the dark hole. He pushed the floorboard back into its place. It looked perfect. No one would find them there. He stood up and checked his watch. It was almost 11 o'clock. He had 1 hour before his meeting with Mrs. Thorne in the library car. He decided to leave his room. He did not want to be in a small space if the men in suits came back. He wanted to be in a public area where people could see him. He stepped out into the hallway. He made sure to lock his door. He walked slowly toward the back of the train. He tried to act like a normal, bored traveler. He looked at the wooden walls and the brass lamps. He passed a few other passengers, but they did not look at him. They were reading books or looking at the snow. As he walked, he saw Mr. Vance at the end of the hallway. The conductor was talking to one of the large men in suits. They were speaking in low voices. When they saw Henry, they stopped talking immediately. Mr. Vance gave him a cold, empty smile. Henry did not smile back. He kept walking, but he could feel their eyes on his back. Every step felt heavy. He knew they were waiting for him to make a mistake. Henry was walking toward the library car when he felt the floor tilt. The rhythm of the wheels changed. The fast, steady beating of the metal became slower and heavier. He looked out of the hallway window. The dark green trees were no longer a blur. He could see the individual branches covered in thick, white ice. The silver arrow was slowing down. Henry was confused. According to his travel schedule, there was no station for another 4 hours. They were in the middle of a high mountain pass. There was nothing here but snow and rocks. He stopped near a window and watched. A small building appeared in the distance. It was made of dark wood and had a steep, snowy roof. There were no lights in the windows. No smoke came from the chimney. As the train came to a full stop, Henry saw a wooden sign. The letters were faded and hard to read, but it said, Station 14. The train stopped with a final, heavy jolt. The silence that followed was strange. On a normal train, you would hear the sound of people talking or doors opening. Here, there was only the sound of the wind blowing against the metal sides of the carriages. Henry stayed in the shadows of the hallway. He did not want to be seen. He watched the platform through the glass. The snow was very deep, reaching the knees of anyone who stood there. 2 men stepped off the train. They were the same large men in suits Henry had seen before. They were carrying heavy flashlights. The bright beams of light cut through the falling snow. Mr. Vance stepped out after them. He stood on the platform and looked at his gold watch. He did not look like a man at a normal station. He looked like he was waiting for a delivery. Henry waited for the doors to open for the passengers. Usually, at a station, people get off to stretch their legs or smoke a cigarette. But the doors stayed closed. The locks remained shut. Henry tried the handle of the nearest exit door. It did not move. It was locked from the outside. We are prisoners, Henry whispered to himself. On the platform, the men in suits walked toward the back of the train. They reached the storage car. They opened a heavy sliding door. Henry could not see what was inside, but he saw the men lifting something heavy. It was a long, wooden crate. They pushed it into the train and closed the door quickly. Mr. Vance signaled to the driver. He climbed back onto the train, and the men in suits followed him. A moment later, the engine started again. The Silver Arrow began to move away from Station 14. Henry watched the small, dark building disappear into the white storm. No one had entered the station. No one had left the train. The stop was only for that wooden crate. Henry felt a cold shiver. What was in the box? And why was this station not on any map? He looked at his watch. It was 11:45. He needed to get to the library car. The mystery was growing larger, and he was running out of time. Henry stood by the heavy metal exit door. The train was moving fast again. The sound of the wheels was a loud, constant rhythm. He looked at the brass handle of the door. It was cold and shiny. He reached out his hand and gripped the metal. He pulled down hard. The handle did not move. He tried again with both hands. The door was completely locked. It was like trying to open a mountain wall. The doors are locked for your safety, Mr. Archer. The voice was low and as cold as ice. Henry jumped and turned around. Mr. Vance was standing right behind him. He had walked silently on the thick red carpet. His blue uniform was perfect. His white gloves were clean. His grey eyes were sharp and unfriendly. "Why is it locked?" Henry asked. He tried to sound brave, but his voice was thin. "In a station, the doors should be open. I wanted to get some fresh air." "The mountain air is not fresh, sir," Mr. Vance said. He did not move. He stood like a statue. "At this altitude, the air is thin. The wind is very strong. If a passenger opens a door while the train is moving, the pressure can pull them out. They would fall into the deep snow and never be found. We lock the doors to keep our guests alive." Henry looked at the conductor. "We were not moving a minute ago. We were at Station 14. Why were the doors locked then?" Mr. Vance stepped one step closer. He was a tall man, and he looked very powerful. "Station 14 is a private service station. It is not for passengers. It is for the train's technical needs. You should not be looking out the windows at such times. Mr. Archer, it is better to stay in your cabin and rest." "I saw your men," Henry insisted. He knew he was being dangerous, but he could not stop. They put a large wooden crate into the storage car. What was in it? The conductor's face became very hard. His eyes turned into small, dark stones. The air in the hallway felt even colder than before. "You have a very active imagination, Mr. Archer. First, you imagine a woman in cabin 4. Now, you imagine mysterious crates at service stations. Perhaps the thin air is making you sick." "I saw what I saw," Henry said. "Listen to me carefully," Mr. Vance said. He leaned forward. His voice was a dangerous whisper. "The Silver Arrow is a very private train. Our owners value privacy more than anything. People who ask too many questions often find that their journey ends sooner than they expected. Do you understand me?" It was a clear threat. Henry felt a shiver of fear go down his spine. He was alone with a man who could make him disappear. "I was just going to the library car," Henry said. He looked at the floor. "I want to find a book." Mr. Vance stepped back and pointed down the long, narrow hallway. "The library is that way. Go there now. And stay away from the doors. I do not want to have an accident on my train." Henry walked away as fast as he could. He felt the conductor's eyes on his back. Every step felt heavy. He was walking toward the meeting with Mrs. Thorne, but he felt like he was walking deeper into a trap. Henry pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the library car. This room was very different from the rest of the train. The walls were covered with shelves of old, leather books. The air was warm and smelled like dry paper and vanilla. There were soft, green chairs and small tables with green lamps. It was very quiet. The sound of the train wheels was soft here because the walls were thick. Henry looked around the room. He was looking for Mrs. Thorne, but the library was almost empty. Only one person was sitting in a corner near the back. It was a man with grey hair and thick glasses. He was wearing a brown jacket and reading a large book. Henry remembered seeing him in the dining car. He looked like a teacher or a professor. Henry walked slowly toward the third shelf, as Mrs. Thorne's note had said. He scanned the titles of the books. He saw books about history, science, and travel. Then, he saw it. A bright blue cover. The title was The Birds of the North. He reached for the book, but a hand suddenly touched his arm. Henry jumped and almost dropped his glasses. It was the man in the brown jacket. He had moved very quietly. "It is a fascinating book," the man said. His voice was soft and very calm. "But the maps inside are even more interesting." Henry looked at the man. "Who are you?" "My name is Professor Aries," the man replied. He did not let go of Henry's arm. "I saw you talking to the conductor earlier. You looked very upset." Henry did not know if he could trust this man. He looked at the professor's eyes. They were kind, but they also looked very tired. "I am looking for a friend," Henry said. Professor Aries nodded slowly. "The woman in the green coat. Elena. I saw her yesterday evening. She was standing near the luggage car. She looked like she was waiting for someone. She seemed very anxious." Henry felt a wave of relief. "You saw her? Then she is real. Mr. Vance told me I imagined her. He told me the room was empty." The professor sighed and sat back in his chair. "Mr. Vance is a very good liar. It is his job to keep the passengers quiet. But I know Elena. I worked with her at the university many years ago. She is a brilliant woman. If she is missing, then something very bad is happening on this train." "Where is she now?" Henry asked. He sat down in the chair across from the professor. "I do not know," the professor whispered. He looked toward the door to make sure no one was watching. "But I saw the men in suits taking her toward the front of the train late last night. They were very quiet. They used a service door that passengers are not allowed to use." Henry felt a mix of hope and fear. Elena was alive, but she was a prisoner. "Mrs. Thorne told me to meet her here," Henry said. "She said there is a map." The professor pointed to the blue book in Henry's hand. "Open it to page 100. Mr. Archer, we do not have much time. The train is moving toward the border, and once we cross it, it will be too late to help her." Henry held the blue book, The Birds of the North, in his shaking hands. He felt the weight of it. He looked at Professor Aries, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Henry turned the pages slowly. The paper was old and thin. Finally, he reached page 100. Between the pages, there was a folded piece of white paper. It was not part of the book. Henry pulled it out and opened it carefully on the small table. It was a map, but it was not a normal map of the country. It was a hand-drawn map of the train tracks through the mountains. There were red lines, black dots, and several notes written in small, neat letters. "Look at the red line," Professor Aries whispered. He pointed his thin finger at the paper. "That is the official route of the Silver Arrow. It goes from the coast to the central city. Every passenger on this train thinks they are going to the capital." Henry followed the red line with his eyes. It was a long, straight path. Then, he saw a black line that started near a place marked Bridge 4. The black line moved away from the main tracks and went deep into a dark, forest area. At the end of the black line, there was a large circle with the words "The Iron Gate" written inside. "What is this black line?" Henry asked. "That is the truth," the professor said. His voice was full of sadness. In 1 hour, the train will reach Bridge 4, but it will not go across the bridge toward the city. There is a secret switch in the tracks. The train will turn left and go into the private forest. That forest belongs to the company that owns the train. Henry looked at the map in shock. But the passengers? They will notice if the train goes the wrong way. Most passengers will be eating lunch or sleeping. The professor explained. The switch happens in a very dark part of the mountain. It is very smooth. By the time people realize the sun is in the wrong place, it will be too late. The train will be behind high walls and heavy gates. No one ever leaves the iron gate. Henry felt a cold wind of fear. Is that where they are taking Elena? Yes. The professor said. They are taking her to their private prison. They want to keep her there until she gives them the code. And once she gives it to them, she will never be seen again. They cannot let her go because she knows too much. Henry looked at the map again. We have to stop the train. We have to tell the other passengers. The professor shook his head. No, Mr. Archer. If you try to start a panic, Mr. Vance will stop you. He has guards everywhere, and the other passengers might not believe you. They think this is a luxury vacation. They want to believe they are safe. Then what can we do? Henry asked. You must go to the back of the train. The professor said. There is a storage car there. In that car, there are tools and emergency equipment. You must find a way to slow the train down before it reaches the switch. Henry stood up. He felt a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a witness. He had to be an actor in this story. He folded the map and put it in his pocket. I will go now. Henry said. Be careful. Henry. The professor warned. They are watching the hallways. Use the small service doors between the carriages. And do not trust anyone in a uniform. Henry left the library car quietly. He did not look back at Professor Aries. He kept his head down and walked through the heavy doors. The air between the carriages was very cold and loud. The wind made a whistling sound as it pushed through the small gaps in the metal. Henry felt the train shaking. It was moving faster now, rushing toward Bridge 4 and the secret switch. He remembered the professor's advice. He did not use the main hallway. Instead, he looked for the small service doors. These doors were painted the same color as the walls, so they were hard to see. He found one near the luggage area. He pushed it open and found himself in a narrow, dark passage. It was used by the staff to move supplies. It smelled of oil and old metal. Henry walked quickly. He passed the kitchen car. He could hear the cooks shouting and the sound of metal pans hitting each other. He did not stop. He moved to the next carriage, and then the next. Finally, he reached the very end of the passenger section. In front of him was a heavy, grey door. This was the entrance to the storage car. There was a small, round window in the door. The glass was thick and dirty. Henry wiped the dust away with his sleeve and looked inside. The storage car was filled with large wooden boxes and metal crates. This was where the men in suits had put the mysterious crate from Station 14. Henry tried the handle. It was locked, just like the other doors. He looked around for a way in. He saw a small metal box on the wall. It was an emergency box. He opened it and found a heavy iron bar. He took the bar and looked at the lock. He knew he had to be quiet. If he made too much noise, the guards would hear him. He put the end of the iron bar into the space between the door and the wall. He pulled with all his strength. His muscles hurt, and his face turned red. Slowly, with a loud groan of metal, the lock broke. The door swung open. Henry stepped into the storage car. It was very cold here because there was no heater. He walked between the tall stacks of crates. He was looking for tools to slow the train. But then he saw something else. In the corner of the room, there was a small area behind some blue curtains. The curtains were moving gently with the motion of the train. Henry walked toward them. He felt a cold knot in his stomach. He pushed the curtain aside. On a small wooden chair, there was a bright red coat. It was Elena's coat. It was folded neatly, but there was a small tear on the shoulder. Next to the coat, on the floor, was the black leather bag. It was open and empty. Henry felt a wave of sadness and anger. Elena was not here, but her things were. They had taken her documents and moved her somewhere else. He looked at the red coat and felt more determined than ever. He was not just an architect anymore. He was a man on a mission. He began to search the crates for a heavy tool or a way to reach the train's brake system. He knew the switch at Bridge 4 was coming very soon. Henry looked at the red coat on the chair. He felt a deep sadness in his heart. He picked up the black leather bag. It was completely empty. All the important documents were gone. He looked around the storage car again. It was a cold, dark place. There were many tall boxes and heavy machines. In the corner, he saw another door. This door was made of thick iron. He walked to the iron door. It looked very strong. There was a small, circular window in the middle of it. The glass was covered in frost. Henry used his hand to wipe away the ice. He leaned forward and looked inside. The room behind the door was very small. It looked like a tiny prison cell. There was only a metal bench and a small lamp on the wall. The light was very weak. In the corner of the room, he saw a bright color. It was red. Henry looked closer. Elena was there. She was wearing her red coat again. She was sitting on the cold metal bench. Her back was against the wall. Her head was down, and her eyes were closed. She looked very tired and very small. She did not know that Henry was watching her through the window. Henry felt a mix of fear and hope. She was alive. She was right there, just behind this iron door. He wanted to knock on the glass. He wanted to shout her name. He wanted to tell her that he was there to help. But he remembered the warning from Professor Aries. He remembered the cold eyes of Mr. Vance. He had to stay quiet. He looked at the lock on the iron door. It was a very big, complex lock. He could not break it with his iron bar. He needed a special key. He remembered the silver chain around Mr. Vance's waist. The master key was there. Suddenly, Henry heard a sound. It was the sound of heavy boots hitting the metal floor. The noise was coming from the hallway. Someone was coming to the storage car. Henry looked around for a place to hide. He saw a large wooden crate near the wall. The top of the crate was open. He jumped inside and pulled some old blankets over his head. He sat in the dark and tried to be as still as a stone. His heart was beating so loudly that he thought the guards would hear it. The heavy door of the storage car opened. Two men walked inside. Henry could hear their deep voices. They were the men in suits. "Is she still quiet?" one man asked. "Yes." The other replied, "She does not speak. But she will talk when we reach the iron gate. No one stays quiet there." They walked past Henry's crate. Their footsteps were very loud on the metal floor. They stopped in front of the iron door. Henry heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. He waited in the dark, holding his breath. He knew he had to follow them, but he had to be very, very careful. Henry stayed very still inside the wooden crate. The old blankets smelled like dust and oil. He could hear the two guards talking near the iron door. Their voices were deep and sounded bored. They did not know that an architect was hiding only a few meters away. "We need to check the heating system in the cell," one guard said. "The boss does not want her to freeze before we get the code." Henry heard the heavy iron door move. It made a long, scratching sound against the floor. He heard the guards walk into the small room where Elena was held. He heard a low murmur of voices. He could not hear what Elena was saying, but she sounded weak. "Eat your food," the other guard commanded. "You will need your strength for the journey to the Iron Gate." A few minutes passed. It felt like hours to Henry. He was afraid to move even a finger. Finally, the guard stepped back into the main storage car. Henry heard the iron door close. There was a loud, metallic sound as the lock turned. The guards walked toward the exit. Their heavy boots made a rhythmic noise on the metal floor. "I am going to the dining car," one guard said. "I am hungry." "I will join you," the second guard replied. "The conductor is watching the front. No one can get back here anyway." The heavy door of the storage car opened and then closed. Silence returned to the room. Henry waited for a full minute. He wanted to be sure they were gone. Then, he pushed the blankets aside and climbed out of the crate. His legs felt stiff and cold. He ran to the iron door. "Elena," he whispered. He put his face close to the small, frosty window. "Elena, it is Henry. Can you hear me?" Inside the cell, the woman moved. She stood up slowly and walked to the door. Her face appeared behind the glass. She looked very tired, but her eyes became bright when she saw him. "Henry, how are you here?" she asked. Her voice was muffled by the thick door. "I followed them," Henry said. "I have a map. I know about the switch at Bridge 4. I know they are taking you to the Iron Gate." Elena shook her head sadly. "You must leave, Henry. It is too dangerous. They have guns. They will kill you if they find you." "I am not leaving without you," Henry said firmly. He looked at the big lock. "I need a key. The guards have them, and Mr. Vance has the master key. I will find a way to open this." "Wait," Elena said. "Look in the blue box near the back. The workers keep their tools there. Sometimes they leave a spare emergency key for the mechanical systems." Henry nodded. He turned away from the door and began to search the storage car. He found a large blue metal box sitting on a high shelf. He stood on his tiptoes and pulled it down. It was heavy and filled with metal tools. He searched through the wrenches and hammers. His hands were shaking with cold and excitement. He did not find a key to the iron door, but he found something else. It was a long, thin piece of steel with a hooked end. To a normal person, it was just a tool, but to an architect who understood how things were built, it was a way to open a lock. Henry held the thin steel tool in his hand. He tried to push it into the large lock of Elena's iron door. He moved the metal hook left and then right. He heard the sound of metal rubbing against metal, but the lock did not open. It was a very old and very strong mechanism. Henry was a talented architect, but he was not a thief. He knew how to design a building, but he did not know how to open a high-security lock without a key. "I cannot open it yet," Henry whispered through the frosty glass of the small window. "The metal is too soft. I need something stronger to turn the lock." Elena looked at him. Her eyes were full of sadness and fear. "You must go, Henry. The guards will be back soon. They only went to the dining car to eat. If they find you here, they will lock you in a cell too. Then no one will be able to help us." Henry knew she was right. He could not help her if he was a prisoner. He needed to know where the enemies were. He also wanted to find Professor Ares. The professor was the only person who understood the map and the secret of the Iron Gate. If they worked together, they could find a way to stop the train before it reached Bridge 4. "I will go to the dining car," Henry said. I will see where the guards are sitting. Then I will find the professor. He might have a better tool or a plan. Henry left the storage car. He moved quietly back through the narrow service passage. The air was thick with the smell of engine oil and old smoke. He reached the heavy door that led into the main part of the train. He looked through a tiny gap in the door frame. The dining car was busy. He saw the two large men in suits. They were sitting at a small table near the kitchen. They were eating large plates of meat and drinking red wine. They were laughing and talking loudly. They looked very relaxed. They did not think a quiet architect was a threat to their plan. Henry looked around the room for Professor Aries. He checked every table and every chair. The professor was not there. Henry felt a new wave of worry. He left the dining car area and walked back to the library car. The library was empty. The green lamps were still glowing with a soft light, but the room felt cold and lonely. The chair where the professor had been sitting was pushed back. Henry walked over to the bookshelf where they had found the blue book. On the floor, near the edge of the red carpet, Henry saw something small and shiny. He knelt down and picked it up. It was a pair of thick glasses. They were broken. One of the glass lenses was cracked into many small pieces. They belonged to Professor Aries. Henry felt his heart sink. The professor did not leave the library because he wanted to. Someone had taken him by force. The quiet man in the brown jacket was now a prisoner too. Or perhaps something even worse. Henry was now truly alone. He held the broken glasses in his hand and looked at the dark forest passing by outside. The train was moving faster now. The sound of the wind was like a long, low howl against the windows. He had to act quickly. Henry stood in the center of the library car. The broken glasses of Professor Aries felt heavy in his hand. He looked at the cracked glass and felt a wave of guilt. He had left the professor alone, and now the old man was gone. The library, which felt safe only a few minutes ago, now felt like a dangerous trap. The shadows behind the bookshelves seemed to move as the train swayed. Henry knew he could not go back to the dining car. The guards were there. He could not go to the front of the train because Mr. Vance was watching the hallway. He was stuck in the middle. He looked at the walls of the library. They were covered in dark wood and thick green curtains. The curtains were there to block the light from the windows during the day. He walked to the back of the room, near the last bookshelf. He noticed that one of the long green curtains was not hanging straight. It was tucked behind a small wooden pillar. Henry reached out and pulled the heavy fabric aside. Behind the curtain, there was no window. Instead, there was a small door. It was not made of wood like the other doors on the Silver Arrow. It was made of dull, grey metal. It was very narrow, barely wide enough for a man to walk through. There was no handle, only a small silver keyhole and a tiny metal plate. Henry touched the cold metal. This was not a door for passengers. It was a secret way through the train. He remembered what the professor had said about the staff using private paths. This door likely led to the internal parts of the carriage, the places where the pipes and wires were hidden. He looked at the small keyhole. He did not have a key, but he still had the thin steel tool he found in the storage car. He took the tool from his pocket. His hands were cold, but he felt a new spark of hope. He pushed the hooked end of the tool into the keyhole. He moved it slowly, feeling for the internal parts of the lock. He remembered how he used to study the blueprints of old buildings. He imagined the inside of the lock in his mind. He heard a soft, metallic slide. He pushed the door, and it opened with a long, slow groan. Behind the door was a very dark and narrow passage. It was filled with the smell of warm oil and the loud iron heartbeat of the train. There were no lamps here. The only light came from the library behind him. Henry stepped into the dark. He pulled the metal door shut. He was now inside the bones of the Silver Arrow. The walls were close to his shoulders. Above his head, He could see thick cables and copper pipes. The floor was made of metal plates that shook violently with every turn of the wheels. He began to walk forward, feeling the walls with his hands. He did not know where this path led, but it was moving toward the front of the train. He hoped it would lead him to the conductor's office or the engine. He had to find a way to stop the train before it reached the secret switch. He moved slowly in the dark, his heart beating fast. He was no longer a passenger. He was a shadow moving through a machine of secrets. The passage was tighter than Henry had imagined. He had to turn his body sideways to squeeze past thick clusters of copper pipes that pulsed with hot steam. The air was a thick soup of grease and heat, making it hard to breathe. The walls vibrated with such intensity that his teeth felt loose in his gums. This was the iron heart of the Silver Arrow, the hidden space where the luxury of the cabins met the raw, brutal power of the engine. He crawled on his hands and knees over a series of metal ribs. Every few meters, he found a small ventilation grate that looked out into the main hallway. He peered through one and saw the shoes of a guard walking past. The man was whistling a cheerful tune, completely unaware that a desperate architect was watching him from the shadows of the wall. As Henry moved further toward the front of the train, the noise of the engine grew louder, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that felt like a giant's heartbeat. He reached a section where the passage widened slightly near a junction of electrical wires. Here, he found a small, rectangular observation window covered in a thin layer of grime. He wiped a circle clean and looked through. He wasn't looking at the hallway anymore. He was looking directly into the conductor's office. The room was empty, but a lamp was still lit on the desk. Henry saw the gold pocket watch Mr. Vance had been holding earlier. Next to it sat a heavy ring of silver keys. One of them was significantly larger than the others, with a complicated, ornate head. It was the master key, the key that could open Elena's cell and the storage car. Henry looked at his watch. 12:20 p.m. According to the map, Bridge 4 was less than 20 minutes away. Suddenly, the office door opened. Mr. Vance walked in, followed by one of the men in suits. The conductor looked frustrated. He threw his white gloves onto the desk and turned to face the guard. "The professor is secure in the forward hold?" Mr. Vance asked. His voice was muffled by the wall, but Henry could hear the sharp edge of it. "Yes, sir," the guard replied. "But we haven't found the architect. His room is empty, and he isn't in the dining car. He's somewhere in the carriages." "Find him," Vance hissed. "He has the whistle. If he reaches the city and speaks to the authorities, the Iron Gate project is finished. We have the girl, but we need that man before we hit the switch at Bridge 4. Once we are on the private line, it won't matter, but until then, he is a loose thread." Henry felt a surge of adrenaline. He was the loose thread. He looked at the keys on the desk, only a few feet away from him, separated by a thin wall of wood and metal. If he could get into that office, he could save everyone. But if he was caught in the crawl space, he would be trapped like a rat. The train began to bank into a sharp curve. Outside, through the office window, Henry saw the distant silhouette of a massive stone bridge. Bridge 4. The moment of the switch was almost here. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched through the grimy observation window as Mr. Vance grabbed his coat. "I'm going to the engine room," Vance said, his voice cold and determined. "I want to be there when we hit the switch. You, check the library again. If that architect is hiding behind the bookshelves, drag him out. Do not be gentle." The guard nodded and followed Vance out of the office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the gold pocket watch and the roar of the wind outside. The silver keys sat on the desk, glinting under the lamp like a promise of freedom. Henry didn't hesitate. He looked for a way into the office. The observation window was too small and bolted shut. He crawled further along the crawlspace, his hands frantic, until he found a small wooden panel held in place by 4 brass screws. It was a maintenance hatch for the electrical wiring behind the conductor's desk. He didn't have a screwdriver. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the thin steel tool he'd found in the storage car. Using the hooked end, he jammed it into the head of the first screw. He twisted with all his might. The metal groaned, but the screw turned. 1, 2, 3. By the 4th screw, his fingers were bleeding, but he didn't care. He pushed the panel inward. It fell onto the office floor. Henry squeezed his shoulders through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the thick carpet behind the desk. He scrambled to his feet, gasping for the cooler air of the room. He reached out and grabbed the silver keys. They were heavy and cold in his hand. He quickly stuffed them into his pocket. He also grabbed the gold pocket watch. If he was going to stop this train, he needed to know the exact second they reached the bridge. Suddenly, the floor of the train tilted sharply to the left. A loud, metallic echo through the carriage. The switch. Henry whispered. The train wasn't slowing down. In fact, it seemed to be gaining speed. He looked out the window. The main tracks, the ones leading to the safety of the city, were peeling away to the right. The silver arrow was now hurtling down the black line of the map, the secret path toward the iron gate. He had to get back to the storage car. He had to free Elena and find the professor. But as he turned toward the office door, he saw the brass handle begin to rotate. Someone was coming back. Henry looked at the maintenance hatch. It was too late to crawl back through. He dove under the heavy oak desk, pulling his knees to his chest and praying the shadows would hide him. The door swung open, and he saw a pair of polished black boots step into the room. The boots were inches from Henry's face. He could smell the fresh polish and the faint scent of snow clinging to the leather. It was Mr. Vance. The conductor let out a sharp, irritated breath. Henry saw his hand reach for the desk, but it stopped mid-air. "The keys," Vance whispered, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold, white-hot rage. "Where are the keys?" Henry pressed his back against the underside of the desk. He held the silver ring of keys so tightly that the metal bit into his palm. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He felt like a ghost, hoping the shadows would swallow him whole. Vance spun around, his boots scuffing the carpet. He let out a roar of fury and slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk. The vibration rattled Henry's teeth. "Guards!" Vance screamed, moving toward the door. "Someone has been in my office. Seal the carriage. Find the architect. He has the master keys." The moment Vance stepped out into the hallway to shout for his men, Henry saw his chance. It was a narrow window of time, seconds, perhaps. He scrambled out from under the desk. He didn't go for the maintenance hatch. It was too slow. He looked at the heavy office window. It was locked with a brass latch. Henry grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the desk, a model of the silver arrow itself, and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered, the sound swallowed by the roar of the wind outside. Cold, mountain air rushed into the room, bringing a swirl of snow with it. He climbed onto the sill. The train was moving at a terrifying speed, leaning into the curves of the private line. Below him, the ground was a blur of black rock and white ice. He didn't look down. He grabbed a metal handrail on the outside of the carriage and swung himself out. He was now on the exterior of the train. The wind tried to tear him away, its icy fingers pulling at his coat. He moved slowly, hand over hand, toward the back. He needed to get back to the storage car. He had the keys. He could free Elena. As he moved along the side of the car, he saw the underside of the carriage. He remembered what the professor had said about stopping the train. He saw the thick rubber hoses and the heavy metal pistons of the braking system. If he could find the emergency release valve, he could force the train to a halt. But first, He had to survive the wind. He reached the end of the carriage and slipped through the gap between the cars, landing hard on the metal floor of the coupling. He was gasping for air, his face numb from the cold. He looked at the keys in his hand. He was still in the game. Henry didn't stop to catch his breath. Every second the wheels turned brought them closer to the iron gate. He scrambled over the metal coupling, his boots slipping on the ice-covered plates. He reached the heavy grey door of the storage car. With trembling fingers, he pulled the ring of silver keys from his pocket. He found the large, ornate master key and jammed it into the lock. It turned. Henry burst into the storage car. The air inside was still freezing, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the howling gale outside. He ran straight for the iron cell. "Elena, I have the keys." He didn't wait for her to answer. He tried the keys one by one until a small, notched silver key clicked. The iron door groaned open. Elena stood there, her face a mask of shock and relief. She lunged forward, grabbing Henry's arms to steady herself. "You came back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I told you I wouldn't leave you," Henry said. He shoved the keys back into his pocket. "But we have to hurry. We've passed the switch. We're on the private line." Elena's eyes widened. "Then we have less than 10 minutes. The iron gate has a sensor. If the train doesn't arrive at the scheduled speed, the guards at the perimeter will open fire. But if we stop it now, while we're still in the ravine, we might have a chance to disappear into the woods." "How do we stop it?" Henry asked, looking around at the crates. "I saw the pneumatic lines outside, but I didn't know which one to cut." Elena pointed to a small, red metal box bolted to the wall near the coupling door. It was marked with a yellow stripe. "The conductor's valve. It's the emergency override for the entire pneumatic braking system. If we pull that, it vents the air pressure from the lines. The brake shoes will lock onto the wheels automatically." Henry ran to the box. He tried to pull the handle, but it was locked with a heavy lead seal and a steel pin. "It's stuck." "Use the iron bar," Elena shouted. Henry grabbed the tool he'd used earlier. He wedged it behind the pin and leaned his entire body weight into it. The metal screamed. With a sharp snap, the pin sheared off. Henry grabbed the red handle and pulled it down with a desperate yell. A deafening hiss of escaping air filled the carriage. It sounded like a giant serpent. Beneath their feet, the train let out a violent, mechanical shriek. The floor buckled as the brake shoes slammed against the spinning steel wheels. Henry and Elena were thrown forward as the silver arrow began to fight against its own momentum. Sparks flew past the windows, lighting up the dark forest in bursts of orange and white. The carriage jolted and swayed, the wooden crates around them shifting and crashing to the floor. "Hold on." Henry reached out, grabbing a bolted-down shelf with one hand and Elena's coat with the other. Slowly, painfully, the roar of the engine was replaced by the grinding of metal. The train shuddered one last time and came to a bone-jarring halt. Silence followed, a heavy, unnatural silence that was broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. "We stopped," Henry gasped, his heart nearly bursting. "Not for long," Elena said, looking toward the front of the train. "Vance and the guards will be coming, and they'll be armed." The silence that followed the screeching of the brakes was deafening. The silver arrow sat like a dead metal giant in the middle of a steep, snowy ravine. The only sound was the clicking of the cooling metal and the distant, rhythmic thud of a door being kicked open at the front of the train. "The professor," Henry whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Vance said he was in the forward hold. We can't leave him behind." "He's right," Elena agreed, checking the corridor. "But the forward hold is past the engine, near the staff quarters. We'll have to go through the service passages again. If we use the main hallway, we're sitting ducks." They moved quickly, slipping into the narrow maintenance tunnels Henry had discovered earlier. Without the vibration of the engine, every scuff of their boots against the metal floor sounded like a gunshot. Henry led the way, using a small flashlight he'd found in the toolkit. As they reached the junction between the first-class carriages and the engine, they heard voices. Angry, desperate voices. "I don't care how you do it." Mr. Vance's voice echoed through the ventilation grates. "Get the emergency lights on. If that architect gets away with the keys, the board will have our heads. Search every inch of this train." Henry and Elena stayed frozen as a guard ran past their hiding spot. Once the footsteps faded, they scrambled toward the forward hold, a small, windowless compartment used for high-value cargo. Henry fumbled with the master keys. His hands were shaking so much he dropped them twice. "Come on, come on." Finally, the lock clicked. He threw the door open. Inside, slumped in a corner, was Professor Aries. His brown jacket was torn, and he was missing his broken glasses. But he looked up with a spark of hope as the light hit him. "Mr. Archer," the professor rasped. "I see you found the blue book." "We found more than that, Professor," Henry said, helping the older man to his feet. "We stopped the train. But we have to move. Now." "The documents," Elena said, looking at the professor. "Did they take them?" The professor reached into his vest and pulled out a small, flat microfilm canister. "I managed to swap the papers in the bag for old newspapers before they caught me. They have the bag, but I have the proof." Henry felt a surge of triumph, but it was short-lived. A beam of light hit the wall at the end of the passage. "There they are!" A guard shouted. "Run!" Henry yelled. They didn't head for the doors. They headed for the jagged hole Henry had made in the conductor's office window. It was their only way out into the wilderness. The snow outside was deep and the wind was howling. But the forest offered a cover that the metal halls of the Silver Arrow never could. They reached the office. Henry helped Elena and the professor onto the sill. The ground was only a few feet below them now that the train was tilted into the side of the ravine. "Jump!" Henry commanded. One by one, they vanished into the white abyss of the mountain night. Henry was the last to leave. As he stood on the sill, he looked back and saw Mr. Vance standing at the office door, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. Henry didn't wait. He leaped into the snow. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against their lungs as they scrambled through the waist-deep snow. Behind them, the Silver Arrow sat like a dying ember's glow against the black mountain, its emergency lights flickering weakly. Flashlights from the guards cut through the trees like hungry eyes, scanning the white slopes for any sign of movement. "We can't stay in the open," Elena gasped, her breath a thick cloud. "They'll see our tracks. The ravine curves up ahead," Professor Aries said, clutching the microfilm canister to his chest. "There's an old mountain hut used by the track layers. If we can reach it, we might find a radio." They moved as a single unit, the architect, the scientist, and the professor, forging a path through the frozen wilderness. Henry looked back and saw Mr. Vance standing on the observation deck of the train, his silhouette sharp and menacing. But the conductor was too late. The Silver Arrow was paralyzed, its secrets spilling out into the cold night air. Henry reached into his pocket and felt the cold metal of the silver whistle. Elena had told him to use it only in an emergency. Looking at the guards descending the train embankment, he realized this was it. "Wait," Henry said. He took a deep breath and blew. The sound wasn't a normal whistle. It was a haunting, high-pitched frequency that echoed off the granite walls of the ravine. It wasn't meant for human ears alone. It was a signal for a prearranged rescue team Elena had contacted before the train left the station. Moments later, a bright red flare hissed into the sky from the ridge above them, illuminating the forest in a blood-red glow. The sound of heavy rotors began to vibrate in the air, a mountain rescue helicopter, diverted by the signal. By the time the authorities reached the Silver Arrow, the Iron Gate project was already falling apart. With the microfilm provided by the professor and the testimony of Henry Archer, the illegal operation was exposed to the world. Mr. Vance and the guards arrested at the scene. The conductor was revealed to be a high-ranking mercenary with a long list of international warrants. The documents. The microfilm contained proof of a massive smuggling ring involving stolen technology and political secrets. The Iron Gate. The private facility was raided within 48 hours, and the company behind the Silver Arrow was dissolved. 2 weeks later, Henry stood on a sunny platform in the central city. The air was warm, and the smell of spring flowers had replaced the scent of ice and oil. Elena was there, wearing a new coat, this one a deep, peaceful blue. "You're going back to building skyscrapers?" she asked, a small, genuine smile on her face. "I think I've had enough of strong walls for a while." Henry joked, though his eyes were serious. "I might stick to something a little more grounded. And you?" "The university wants me back," she said. "But I think I'll keep the whistle, just in case." She leaned in and kissed his cheek, the scent of real flowers lingering in the air. As she walked away, Henry reached into his pocket and felt the broken glasses of Professor Aries, which he had kept as a reminder. He had started the journey as a man looking for a quiet vacation, but he left it as a man who knew that even the most beautiful machines can hide the darkest shadows. The Silver Arrow was gone, but the architect had finally found a blueprint for a life worth living. The sun in Central City was too bright. For Henry Archer, the 2 weeks since the derailment of the Silver Arrow had been a blur of police statements, depositions, and sleepless nights. He lived in a small hotel provided by the authorities, yet every time a floorboard creaked, he reached for the heavy brass lamp by his bed. He wasn't just an architect anymore. He was a liability. The morning started with a phone call that went unanswered. It was from Professor Aries. When Henry tried to call back, the line was dead. A cold prickle of familiar dread crawled up his spine. He dressed quickly, grabbing his coat and the small silver whistle, a souvenir he could never bring himself to leave behind. He arrived at the university where the professor held his emeritus office. The hallways were quiet, smelling of floor wax and old knowledge. But when he reached room 402, the door was ajar. The lock hadn't been picked. It had been melted. Inside, the office was a tomb. Books were torn from the shelves, their spines cracked like ribs. The desk where the professor had once decoded the microfilm was overturned. Henry stepped over a shattered bust of Socrates, his heart hammering. "Professor," he whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow room. There was no answer, only the sound of a ticking clock. On the floor, near the window, lay a single item that made Henry's blood run cold. It was a train ticket. Not the blue passenger ticket of the Silver Arrow, but a yellow one. On the back, written in the same messy pencil he had seen before, were 2 words: "Found you." Henry realized then that the Iron Gate wasn't a place you could simply raid and shut down. It was a network. By taking the microfilm, they hadn't ended the game. They had only taken the lead. And now, the organization was taking its pieces back. He ran to the window. Outside, in the bustling courtyard below, he saw a man in a grey suit. The man didn't look up, but he was standing perfectly still amidst the flow of students. He held a black leather bag, the exact twin of the one Elena had carried. Henry didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs 3 at a time. His mind was racing. If they had the professor, then Elena was next. Or perhaps, she was already gone. He burst out of the university doors, the sunlight blinding him for a second. The man in the grey suit was gone. In his place stood a small, black car with tinted windows. The back door opened slightly, as if inviting him in. Henry knew it was a trap. He also knew he had no other choice. If he stayed in the city, they would pick him off at their leisure. If he followed, he might find the thread again. "Looking for someone, Mr. Archer?" A voice called out from the shadows of the stone archway. Henry turned. It wasn't the guard. It was a woman he didn't recognize, wearing a conductor's hat from a different line altogether. She held out a small, silver envelope. "The journey isn't over. It's just changed tracks." Henry stared at the woman in the conductor's hat. She didn't move, her face a mask of professional indifference. The silver envelope she held glinted in the sunlight, reflecting the world back at him in a distorted, metallic curve. He reached out and took it, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy, as if it contained a weight beyond its physical dimensions. "Who are you with?" Henry asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "The company is gone. The Iron Gate was raided." The woman gave a thin, humorless smile. "A gate is just a door in a wall, Mr. Archer. You can knock down the wall, but the people who own the land are still there. They don't like losing their property, especially not to an architect who should have stayed in his office." She turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the crowd of students before Henry could stop her. He looked down at the envelope. There was no name, no address, only a seal made of dark, red wax, a stylized arrow pointing downward into a circle. He retreated to a nearby stone bench, his hands trembling as he broke the seal. Inside was a single card, thick and cream-colored. It bore a map, but it wasn't of the mountains or the train tracks. It was a floor plan of an old industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city, near the docks. One room was circled in red ink. Below it, a single line of text. "The professor is a guest. For now. Bring the whistle." Henry's grip tightened on the card. They wanted the whistle. He looked at the small metal object in his hand. To him, it was a signal for rescue. To them, it must be something more. He remembered Elena's face when she gave it to him, the way she told him to use it only in an emergency. He had assumed she meant a signal for the authorities. But what if the frequency it emitted served another purpose? He stood up, his mind working through the logic of a structure. As an architect, he knew that every building had a weakness, a load-bearing point that, if struck, would bring the whole thing down. This organization was a building made of people and secrets. He just had to find the right point to strike. He couldn't go to the police. If they had taken the professor from the heart of the university, they likely had eyes inside the precinct. He needed to find Elena first. If she was still free, she would know what the whistle really was. He headed for the docks, but he didn't take the main roads. He moved through the narrow alleys and side streets, using the city's architecture to hide his movements. He felt like he was back in the service passages of the Silver Arrow, moving through the bones of the world. As he approached the warehouse district, the air grew thick with the smell of salt and rotting wood. The towering cranes of the docks looked like giant, prehistoric birds in the afternoon haze. He found the warehouse from the map, a derelict brick building with boarded-up windows and a rusted iron gate. He didn't go to the front door. He walked around to the side, looking for a service entrance or a fire escape. He found a high, narrow window with a broken pane. He climbed a stack of wooden pallets, his heart thumping against his ribs. As he pulled himself up to look inside, he saw a flickering blue light reflecting off the interior walls. It was the glow of a computer screen, and sitting in front of it was a figure he recognized instantly. It wasn't the professor. It was Elena. Henry remained motionless, his fingers gripping the rough brick of the warehouse wall. Inside, the blue light of the monitor pulsed like a slow heartbeat, illuminating Elena's face. She wasn't tied to a chair. She wasn't a prisoner in the traditional sense. She was working. Her brow was furrowed in deep concentration, and her fingers danced across the keyboard with a precision that bordered on mechanical. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. Had the entire ordeal on the Silver Arrow been a play? Was she part of the organization after all? He remembered the terror in her eyes, the cold iron cell, and the way she had lunged for safety in the snow. No, the fear had been real. But the woman he was looking at now was someone he didn't recognize. He shifted his weight, and a piece of loose mortar crumbled under his boot, clattering onto the wooden pallets below. The sound was small, but in the silence of the docks, it sounded like a hammer blow. Elena's head snapped up. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, she reached for a small device on the desk and pressed a button. The blue light of the monitor cut out instantly, plunging the corner of the warehouse into shadows. "Henry!" she whispered. Her voice was sharp, a command rather than a question. "If that's you, stay away from the window. There are motion sensors on the frame." Henry froze. "Elena! What is this place? I thought you were in danger. I thought they took the professor." "They did take the professor," she said, her voice coming from the darkness. "And they're coming for you, too. This is a safe house. Or it was until 10 minutes ago. I've been trying to trace the signal from the professor's hearing aid. He has a backup transmitter hidden in the casing." Henry climbed down from the pallets and found a side door that she had remotely unlocked. He stepped into the cool, damp interior of the warehouse. The air smelled of salt and ozone. As his eyes adjusted, he saw the complex network of cables and servers she had hidden behind a wall of empty crates. "The whistle," she said, stepping into the dim light. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. "Did you bring it?" Henry pulled the silver whistle from his pocket. "The woman in the conductor's hat. She said they wanted it. She gave me an envelope with a map leading here." Elena stepped forward and took the whistle from his hand. She didn't look at it like a piece of jewelry. She looked at it like a key. She walked back to her desk and plugged it into a small interface device connected to her computer. "It's not just a whistle, Henry," she explained as lines of green code began to scroll across the revived monitor. "It's a hardware key. The microfilm the professor had. It's encrypted. The Iron Gate wasn't just moving physical goods. They were building a global financial shadow network. This whistle contains the decryption algorithm. Without it, the microfilm is just a series of meaningless dots." So the map was a trap. Henry realized. They knew I would come to you. They didn't just know. Elena said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "They tracked you here. Henry, look at the door." He turned. Through the slats of the iron gate, he saw the headlights of 3 black cars turning into the warehouse lot. The organization hadn't just followed him. They had used him to deliver the final piece of the puzzle directly to them. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the cavernous warehouse like a series of heavy punches. Henry felt the floor vibrate as the engines cut out, leaving a heavy, predatory silence in their wake. The headlights remained on, casting long, distorted shadows of the warehouse's support pillars onto the far wall. "How long until the decryption is finished?" Henry asked, his voice a low whisper. He moved toward a stack of heavy industrial crates, his eyes scanning for anything that could serve as a barricade. "Too long," Elena replied. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard, bypassing security firewalls that flickered red on the screen. 4 minutes, maybe 5. The whistle is old technology. It's reading the internal crystals one at a time. Henry looked at the iron gate. It was rusted, but it was thick. He saw the silhouettes of men moving outside, dark shapes against the glare of the headlights. They weren't rushing in. They were professionals. They were surrounding the perimeter, sealing the exits. They aren't going to blast their way in. Henry observed, his architects mind analyzing the structure. They don't want to damage the servers or the whistle. They'll come in through the roof or the service tunnels to pin us down. He grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from a nearby workbench. It felt cold and reassuringly heavy. Elena, get the data onto a portable drive. I'm going to buy us those 5 minutes. Henry, wait. She called out. But he was already moving. He knew this building. While Elena had been hacking, he had been subconsciously noting the vents and the load-bearing supports. He climbed a rusted ladder to the mezzanine level, a steel catwalk that overlooked the main floor. From here, he could see the entire layout. Suddenly, a glass pane in the skylight shattered. A black rope dropped through the opening, followed quickly by a figure in tactical gear. Then another. They were coming from the roof. Just as he had predicted. Henry didn't wait for them to land. He swung the crowbar against a heavy chain holding a suspended pallet of old engine parts. The metal link snapped. The pallet swung out like a giant pendulum, catching the first man mid-air. The intruder let out a choked cry as he was swept away, crashing into a stack of empty oil drums. The second man landed on the catwalk and reached for a sidearm. Henry lunged. He didn't know how to fight like a soldier, but he knew about momentum and balance. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, using the narrowness of the catwalk to his advantage. They tumbled against the railing, the metal groaning under their weight. Below him, Elena shouted, 70%. Henry, they're at the side door. A blue spark erupted from the server rack as a bullet struck a cooling fan. The organization wasn't worried about the servers anymore. They only wanted the whistle. Henry managed to wrestle the weapon away from the guard, tossing it over the railing into the darkness. He kicked the man's legs out from under him and scrambled back toward the ladder. His lungs burned, and his hands were slick with sweat and grease. 85%. Elena's voice was high with tension. He saw a flash of movement by the service entrance. The woman in the conductor's hat was there. She wasn't wearing the hat anymore. She was wearing a tactical headset, and she was holding a heavy-duty thermal cutter. She began to slice through the lock of the inner security door, the orange sparks illuminating her cold, determined face. 95. Henry reached the floor just as the service door gave way. He grabbed Elena by the arm, pulling her toward the back of the warehouse. The drive. She gasped, holding up a small, glowing USB stick. I have it. And the whistle. The basement. Henry said, pointing to a heavy wooden trapdoor hidden under a layer of discarded canvas. It leads to the old saw lines. If we can get to the water, they can't track our scent or our heat. They dove through the trapdoor just as the warehouse lights flared to life, and the room was filled with the shouting of men. The trapdoor slammed shut above them, plunging Henry and Elena into a world of oppressive dampness and the sound of rushing water. Henry's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off slimy brick walls and rusted iron pipes. This was the old city's underbelly, a network of saws and forgotten tunnels dating back to the turn of the century. Watch your step, Henry whispered, his voice echoing flatly against the wet stone. The masonry down here is unstable. Behind them, they heard the heavy thud of the trapdoor being forced open. The hunters were coming. Bright beams of tactical lights swept across the ceiling of the tunnel above the ladder, searching for them. This way, Elena said, pointing toward a narrower side pipe. If my memory of the city's civil engineering maps is correct, this should lead toward the old storm drain outlet near the canal. They scrambled into the smaller tunnel, forced to hunch their shoulders as the ceiling dipped. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and sulfur. Henry led the way, his boots splashing through several inches of cold, dark runoff. He kept his ears tuned to the sounds behind them, the splashing of multiple boots and the muffled commands of the team in pursuit. As an architect, Henry couldn't help but notice the craftsmanship of the tunnels. The vaulted brickwork was designed to withstand immense pressure, but a century of neglect had left it brittle. He saw a series of heavy timber shoring beams ahead, placed there decades ago to prevent a cave-in. The whistle. Henry panted, glancing back at Elena. Is the data safe? The drive is encrypted, she said, clutching the small USB stick. But they don't need to crack it if they catch us. They just need to make us disappear. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a large junction chamber where 4 different saws met in a swirling pool of dark water. A series of narrow metal walkways crisscrossed the space, suspended by rusted chains. Up there, Henry said, pointing to a walkway that led to a higher level. As they climbed the slick ladder to the walkway, a red laser dot appeared on the wall next to Henry's head. A shot rang out, the sound amplified a dozen times by the chamber's acoustics. The bullet sparked off a metal pipe, releasing a hiss of high-pressure steam. Stop! A voice commanded from the tunnel they had just exited. It was the woman from the warehouse, her tactical gear now stained with saw grime. She stood at the edge of the chamber, her weapon leveled. The data is useless to you. You'll never get out of the city alive. Henry looked at the ceiling above the woman. He saw the main support arch of the chamber, where a massive iron valve sat connected to a series of precarious-looking steam pipes. He remembered the diagram of the city's old heating system. Elena, get to the other side of the walkway. Henry shouted. He didn't wait. He didn't use a gun. He used the crowbar. He swung it with every ounce of strength he had left, striking the release valve of the overhead steam pipe. The iron wheel spun, and the pipe ruptured. A massive cloud of scalding white steam erupted, filling the chamber in seconds. The woman and her team were blinded, their thermal goggles useless in the sudden, intense heat. Go! Henry grabbed Elena's hand, and they disappeared into the white fog, moving toward the sound of the wind that signaled an exit to the surface. The steam was a ghost that followed them through the final stretch of the tunnel. Henry and Elena scrambled through a narrow drainage pipe, their clothes soaked and heavy with the scent of the city's hidden depths. Finally, they reached a heavy iron grate that opened onto the side of the canal. The night air hit them like a cold slap, sharp and clean compared to the sulphurous heat of the saws. Henry kicked at the rusted hinges of the grate. It gave way, and they tumbled onto the mossy stone bank of the great canal. The water was black and sluggish, reflecting the distant, amber lights of the city's industrial district. Far off, the sirens of police cars wailed, a sound that usually meant safety, but now only signaled a world that had been compromised. We need to see what's on that drive. Henry panted, leaning against the cold stone of the canal wall. He checked the master keys in his pocket. They were still there, a heavy reminder of the Silver Arrow. Elena sat on the ground, her chest heaving. She pulled a rugged, waterproof laptop from her bag, a piece of tech she'd grabbed from the warehouse before they fled. She plugged in the USB drive and the silver whistle. I've been running the final decryption in the background. It should be finished. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow over their exhausted faces. Lines of data cascaded down the monitor, organized into neat, terrifying categories. It's not just a bank account, Elena whispered, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the files. Henry, look at this. These are blueprints. Henry leaned in. As an architect, his eyes immediately recognized the schematics. It wasn't a skyscraper or a bridge. It was a subterranean complex, vast and intricate. It was designed with the same brutalist efficiency as the Silver Arrow's internal systems. The Iron Gate, Henry said, his voice barely a breath. The place we raided in the mountains. That was just the entrance. A front. The real facility is here, under the city. It's built into the old foundations of the central station. Elena tapped a key, and a new file opened. It was a high-resolution photograph of a holding cell. Sitting on a wooden bench, his head bowed, was Professor Aries. He looked frail, but he was alive. "They have him at the station," Elena said. "But look at the timestamp on the photo. It was taken 10 minutes ago. They aren't just holding him, they're waiting for something. They're waiting for the whistle." Henry realized. He looked at the silver object still plugged into the laptop. The whistle doesn't just decrypt the data. It's a physical proximity key. To open the main vault at the station facility, you need the signal emitted by this specific frequency. Suddenly, the laptop screen blinked. A red dot appeared on the map of the city. It was moving toward them. "They've tracked the laptop's MAC address," Elena said, her voice rising in panic. "We have to go. Now." "Wait," Henry said, grabbing her arm. "If we keep running, they'll just keep chasing. They have the professor, and they have the city's infrastructure. We can't outrun them, but we can outbuild them." He looked at the blueprints again, his mind racing. He saw a flaw in the station's ventilation design, a legacy of the original 19th century construction that had never been modernized. It was a structural weakness, a lung that the entire underground facility relied on for air. "We aren't going to the police, and we aren't going to hide," Henry said, his eyes hard. "We're going to the central station. We're going to use their own architecture to tear them down." The central station loomed over the city like a cathedral of iron and glass. It was nearly midnight, but the station never truly slept. A thin veil of fog clung to the massive clock tower, which stood at the center of the plaza like a silent sentry. Henry and Elena stood across the street, huddled in the shadows of a newsstand. The blueprints show the entrance to the lower levels is hidden behind the maintenance bay for the old steam engines. Henry whispered. He looked at the massive structure, his mind overlaying the digital blueprints onto the physical building. "But that area is restricted. We'll need to bypass the security gates at the north tunnel." Elena checked her handheld scanner. "The signal from the whistle is still active, but I've masked the frequency. They know we're in the city, but they don't know exactly where. Yet." They moved with the crowd of late-night commuters, blending into the flow of people rushing to catch the last local trains. Henry kept his collar up. Every person in a uniform felt like a threat. Every camera felt like an eye of the Iron Gate. They reached the North Tunnel, a dark, brick-lined passage used mostly for luggage carts. Henry spotted the maintenance door he had seen on the plans. It was unmarked, painted a dull gray to blend into the shadows. He reached for the master keys. "If this works," Henry said, "we'll be directly above their ventilation hub." He found the key that matched the lock, a heavy, square-headed key. It turned, and they slipped inside and closed the door behind them. The air inside the maintenance bay was dry and smelled of old coal and grease. Huge, retired steam locomotives sat like skeletal ghosts in the dim light. Henry led the way past the massive wheels of a 482 mountain-type engine. Behind the third engine, there was a heavy iron floor grate. "This is it," Henry said. He knelt down and pulled at the grate. It was heavy, but as an architect, he knew where the leverage points were. With a sharp tug, the grate popped open, revealing a vertical shaft with a rusted ladder. As they descended, the temperature began to drop. The sound of the station above faded, replaced by a low, mechanical hum that vibrated in Henry's chest. This wasn't the sound of trains. It was the sound of massive industrial fans. They reached the bottom of the shaft and found themselves in a narrow concrete corridor. The walls were lined with thick, black cables that pulsed with electricity. At the end of the hall was a reinforced steel door with a keypad. "Elena, can you bypass it?" "I don't need to," she said, holding up the silver whistle. "Look." As she moved the whistle close to the door, a small blue light on the keypad began to flash. The whistle wasn't just a key. It was an active transponder. The door hissed open, sliding into the wall with a smoothness that spoke of limitless funding. They stepped through and froze. They weren't in a maintenance room. They were standing on a glass balcony overlooking a massive, high-tech command center. Dozens of screens lined the walls, showing live feeds from across the country. In the center of the room, surrounded by glass walls, was a holding cell. Inside the cell, Professor Aries sat at a small table, staring at a chessboard. Standing outside the cell, looking up at the balcony with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, was a man Henry had never seen before, a man in a perfectly tailored white suit. "Welcome to the heart of the machine, Mr. Archer," the man called out. "I've been expecting you to find the lung. Architects are so predictable." The man in the white suit stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking more like a museum curator than a mastermind of a global shadow network. The command center hummed with a clinical, expensive energy. Below the glass balcony, dozens of technicians moved with robotic efficiency, their faces washed in the sterile glow of the surveillance monitors. "Predictability is a flaw in design, Mr. Archer," the man continued, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "You found the ventilation shaft because I left the blueprints in the encrypted file. I wanted you here. I wanted the whistle to return home." Henry gripped the cold metal railing of the balcony. Elena stood beside him, her hand hovering near the laptop in her bag, her eyes scanning the room for exits. "And the professor?" Henry asked, his voice echoing. "The professor is a scholar. He understands that some secrets are too heavy for the world to carry." The man in white said. He signaled to a guard, who tapped a command into a tablet. The glass walls of the professor's cell hummed and became transparent. Professor Aries looked up. His eyes met Henry's, and for a second, the old man's face broke into a look of profound apology. "Henry, the whistle, it's a transmitter, but it's also a trigger. You shouldn't have brought it here." "A trigger for what?" Elena demanded, stepping forward. The man in white smiled, a thin, sharp line. The silver arrow was a test of the signal's range through mountainous terrain. "This facility, however, is the broadcast hub. When that whistle is placed in the central console, it will activate the iron gate, not a physical gate, but a digital one. It will lock down the national financial grid, allowing us to reroute assets in the seconds of chaos that follow. It's a masterpiece of structural collapse. Wouldn't you agree, architect?" Henry looked down at the central console. It was a pillar of black glass in the middle of the room, with a small, circular indentation at the top, the exact size of the silver whistle. "I'm not giving it to you," Henry said, pulling the whistle from Elena's hand. "You don't have to give it to me," the man in white replied. He snapped his fingers. The balcony beneath Henry and Elena suddenly tilted. The floor plates retracted into the wall. Henry lunged for the railing, catching Elena by the coat just as they both slid toward the edge. They tumbled 10 feet down onto the main floor, landing hard on the polished concrete. Before they could scramble to their feet, 4 guards in tactical gear surrounded them, their weapons leveled. The man in white walked down a set of stairs, his steps rhythmic and calm. He reached out his hand, palm up. "The whistle, Mr. Archer. Or we see how well the professor's heart handles the stress test of this facility's security system." Henry looked at the professor, then at the man in white. His mind raced back to the blueprints. He remembered the lung, the ventilation hub. He wasn't just there to find a way in. He had noticed that the cooling pipes for the main servers ran directly beneath the central console. "You want the trigger?" Henry whispered, his eyes moving to a heavy fire extinguisher mounted on a nearby pillar. "Take it." He didn't hand the whistle over. He threw it, not to the man, but directly into the open intake of the high-pressure cooling vent near the floor. The silver whistle disappeared into the dark maw of the intake vent. For a heartbeat, There was silence. Then, a sound erupted from beneath the floorboards. The whistle, designed with precise aerodynamic ridges, wasn't just a key. It was now a foreign object moving at high velocity through the facility's high-speed cooling turbine. "No!" The man in white shrieked, his composure shattering like glass. He lunged toward the vent. But it was too late. A series of violent, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the concrete floor. The whistle had jammed the centrifugal fan blades, causing the motor to seize. As an architect, Henry knew the physics of a catastrophic failure chain. When a primary cooling fan stops abruptly in a high-density server environment, the heat has nowhere to go. "The servers!" One of the technicians yelled, pointing at a wall of monitors. The blue lights were rapidly turning amber. Then a warning, pulsating red. "Core temperature is rising. The liquid cooling loop is overpressurizing." The command center, once a model of clinical efficiency, transformed into a chaotic theater of alarms. High-pitched sirens wailed, and the overhead lights shifted to a harsh, emergency crimson. The man in white turned back to Henry, his face pale with rage. "You've destroyed the broadcast hub. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've saved the grid." Henry panted, pulling Elena toward the cover of a heavy steel terminal. "You can't lock down the banks if your brains are melting." Henry's eyes scanned the room. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for the pressure relief valve. In the blueprints, he had seen that the lung had a safety bypass. If he could trigger a manual vent, the resulting steam and pressure drop would create enough cover for them to reach the professor's cell. "Elena, the override is behind the central pillar." Henry shouted over the roar of the failing machinery. Elena didn't need further instruction. She dove through the legs of a panicked guard, sliding across the polished floor toward a recessed panel. Meanwhile, the cooling pipes began to groan. The sound of metal expanding under extreme heat was like a chorus of dying ghosts. The man in white pulled a small, silver pistol from his vest. "Enough of this. Guards, kill them. I'll retrieve the whistle from the wreckage." The guards raised their weapons, but they were unsteady. The floor was now vibrating so violently that standing still was impossible. Just as the lead guard squeezed the trigger, a massive pipe overhead burst. Not with water, but with a freezing cloud of liquid nitrogen coolant. The room was instantly swallowed by a thick, white fog. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in seconds. Henry heard the guards coughing and the man in white screaming commands that no one could follow in the whiteout. "Henry! I found it!" Elena's voice came from the mist. A heavy clunk echoed through the chamber, followed by the sound of a massive iron door sliding open. It wasn't an exit. It was the professor's cell. The emergency failsafe had triggered, releasing all locks to prevent prisoners from being cooked or frozen in their cells during a system failure. Henry felt a hand grab his arm. It was the professor. "This way, Henry. The maintenance tunnels are venting to the north." The command center was now a landscape of white shadows. The liquid nitrogen, escaping from the ruptured cooling lines, turned the air into a freezing, opaque soup. Henry's breath came in ragged, icy plumes. He gripped the professor's arm with one hand and Elena's with the other, forming a human chain in the blinding mist. "The thermal cameras," Elena hissed, her voice muffled by the thick fog. "They won't stay blind for long. They have backup optics in their helmets." "Then we change the environment," Henry replied. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the stinging cold. He knew the structure of the ceiling was a grid of steel I-beams and heavy-duty electrical conduits. If we can't hide our heat, we hide in the noise. He spotted a high-voltage junction box near the cell's entrance. Using the heavy fire extinguisher he had grabbed earlier, Henry smashed the casing. Sparks erupted, blue and violent, dancing through the nitrogen fog. The electrical interference began to scream through the facility's sensors, creating a snowstorm of static on any remaining surveillance screens. "Over there!" a voice barked. The man in white. He was close, his voice distorted by a gas mask. "I see their silhouettes." "Open fire!" Bullets tore through the fog, pinging off the metal frames of the server racks. Henry pulled the professor behind a thick concrete pillar. "We need to get to the main exhaust shaft. It's the only way out that doesn't go through the security checkpoints." "The exhaust shaft is vertical." "Henry." The professor wheezed, his face pale from the sudden cold. "I don't think my heart can manage a 4-story climb." "We aren't climbing," Henry said, his mind flashing back to the blueprints of the lung. "The shaft has an industrial freight lift for the fan motors. It's counterweighted. If we can trigger the manual release, it will pull us up like a rocket." They moved through the fog, guided more by Henry's memory of the floor plan than by sight. They reached the base of the exhaust shaft, a massive, circular tunnel lined with soot-stained rivets. In the center sat a flat, steel platform. Henry scrambled to the control panel at the side of the shaft. It was a primitive, mechanical system. Exactly what they needed. Digital locks were useless here. He grabbed a heavy iron lever and prepared to throw it. Suddenly, the fog parted. The man in white stepped forward, his suit now stained with grease and ice. He held his silver pistol with both hands, aimed directly at Henry's chest. "You've been a very troublesome architect, Mr. Archer," he said, his voice buzzing behind the mask. "But even the best designs have a final chapter. Step away from the lever." Henry didn't move. He looked at the man, then at the massive counterweight hanging by a thick steel cable just above the man's head. "You're right about designs," Henry said, his hand tightening on the lever. "But you forgot about the load-bearing safety margins. This lift hasn't been serviced in years." Henry didn't pull the lever toward him. He kicked the locking pin out of the counterweight's track. The locking pin skittered across the concrete floor like a spent casing. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, gravity reclaimed its prize. The 3-ton iron counterweight, freed from its rusted track, plummeted. The man in white didn't even have time to scream. He dove to the left, his silver pistol firing a wild shot into the ceiling as the massive block of iron hissed past him. It hit the bottom of the shaft with a bone-jarring thud that shook the entire foundation of Central Station. Simultaneously, the physics of the pulley system took over. With the counterweight falling, the steel platform carrying Henry, Elena, and the professor was jerked upward. "Get down!" Henry yelled, shoving Elena and the professor onto the floor of the lift. The ascent was violent. There were no smooth motors here, only the raw tension of steel cables. The platform rocketed up the circular shaft, sparks flying as the guide rails screamed under the sudden friction. Below them, the command center was rapidly disappearing into a blur of red emergency lights and white nitrogen clouds. They blew past the mezzanine level, the wind whistling through the cracks in the platform. Henry watched the brick walls of the shaft fly by, layers of history passing in seconds. They were moving through the 1920s reinforced concrete, then the 19th century masonry of the original station foundations. "The brakes!" Elena shouted over the roar. "How do we stop this thing?" "We don't," Henry called back, grabbing a support bar. The counterweight hits the buffer at the bottom, and the cable slackens. "We just have to hope the safety catches are still there." As they reached the top of the 4th floor, the platform began to slow, the momentum fighting against the weight of the cables. With a final, sickening jolt, the lift slammed into the overhead spring buffers. The trio was tossed upward, then fell back onto the vibrating metal. The platform hung there, swaying over 100-foot drop, held by a single, straining emergency pawl. "Out! Now!" Henry scrambled toward the maintenance door at the top of the shaft. He kicked it open, and they tumbled into a narrow, dusty attic space. This was the crown of Central Station, the area directly behind the massive glass faces of the four-sided clock tower. The rhythmic mechanism filled the room. Huge brass gears, some larger than Henry, turned with ancient, unstoppable force. "We're behind the clock," the professor whispered, leaning against a wooden beam to catch his breath. "The heart of the city." Henry walked to the glass face of the clock. Through the translucent Roman numeral 6, he could see the station plaza below. Police cars were swarming the area, their blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement. But they weren't there for the Iron Gate. They were there because of the electrical explosion Henry had caused. "They'll be coming up here," Elena said, checking the USB drive in her pocket. "Vance's people, or whatever is left of the station security. We have the data, but we're trapped in a birdcage." Henry looked at the massive gears of the clock. As an architect, he saw more than just a timepiece. He saw a transmission system. "We're not trapped," Henry said, a spark of his old wit returning. "We're just waiting for the right time." The interior of the clock tower was a forest of brass and steel. The smell of cold grease and ancient dust filled the air, thick enough to taste. Above them, the massive pendulum swung with a hypnotic, bone-deep thrum, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the frantic beating of Henry's heart. Through the gaps in the floorboards, he could hear the shouting of guards and the rhythmic clatter of boots on the spiral staircase far below. "They're coming," Elena whispered, her eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door that led to the stairs. "We have 5 minutes, maybe less." "Henry, what are we doing with a clock?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He was running his hands over the primary drive shaft that connected the central movement to the 4 glass faces. He wasn't looking at the time. He was looking at the torque. This wasn't just a clock. It was a massive mechanical battery, storing the potential energy of several thousand pounds of lead weights hanging in the central shaft. "The Iron Gate controls the digital infrastructure," Henry said, his voice gaining the frantic clarity he only found under pressure. "But they don't control the physical world. This clock is a relic. It's entirely mechanical. And it's connected to the station's emergency broadcast antenna, the old copper wire system they used for telegrams before the war." He pointed to a series of thick copper cables that ran from a junction box near the roof down into the heart of the clockwork. "If we can use the rotational energy of the main gear to drive an old-school generator, we can send a raw, unencrypted burst of the data across every radio frequency in the city," Henry explained. "It won't be elegant, but it will be loud. The police, the news stations, the ham radio operators, everyone will hear the signal." Elena's eyes lit up. "A burst transmission. If it's raw data, they can't block it with a firewall because it's not using a protocol they recognize. But Henry, to get that much power, we'd have to release the weights all at once. The clock will be destroyed." "It's a fair trade for the truth," Henry replied. Professor Aries stepped forward, leaning heavily on a brass railing. "The striking train. Henry, look at the centrifugal governor. If you bypass the escapement and let the weights fall freely, the governor will spin at 1,000 RPMs. If we wrap the antenna wire around the drive shaft, the friction and the motion will create a massive electromagnetic pulse, an EMP that will fry their tracking devices and broadcast our data simultaneously." Henry looked at the professor with a newfound respect. "The striking train. Of course. It's designed to handle sudden bursts of energy for the bells." They began to work with a desperate speed. Henry used his master keys to unlock the maintenance housing of the primary gears. Elena pulled the copper wires from the walls, stripping the insulation with her teeth and a small pocket knife. She began to wrap the wire around the main drive shaft, creating a primitive, oversized induction coil. The sound of the guards was louder now. They were at the final landing. The wooden door shuddered under a heavy kick. "Henry, the The strike lever. Elena shouted, connecting the final wire to the laptop's output port. Do it now. Henry grabbed the manual release for the 2-ton lead weights. He looked at the Roman numeral 12 on the glass face. The time was 11:59 and 50 seconds. Happy New Year. Henry muttered, and he pulled the lever. The lever moved. Deep within the tower's stone throat, the heavy lead weights, thousands of pounds of potential energy, broke free from their ratchets. Gravity took hold, and the clockwork groaned as if the tower itself were coming alive. The primary drive shaft began to spin. What was usually a slow, stately movement became a blur of brass. The centrifugal governor, designed to keep the strike rhythm steady, began to whistle as it fought the air. The friction from the copper wires Elena had wrapped around the shaft grew so intense that the smell of burning ozone filled the room. Get back! Henry shouted, shielding his eyes. A blinding blue arc of electricity jumped from the coil to the metal frame of the clock. It wasn't just power, it was the data. The laptop, connected to the improvised induction coil, screamed as it dumped the entirety of the Iron Gate's files into the electromagnetic field. The signal didn't travel through wires. It traveled through the very air as a massive, raw radio burst. Outside, across the city of Central Station, televisions flickered. Radios hissed. Every smartphone within a 5-mile radius suddenly displayed a cascading wall of names, bank accounts, and blueprints of the underground facility. The Iron Gate was no longer a secret. It was a public broadcast. The guards finally burst through the door, their tactical lights cutting through the dust. But as they stepped onto the wooden floorboards, their electronics failed. Their headsets emitted a piercing squeal, and their tactical tablets went dark, the screens fried by the electromagnetic pulse. Drop your weapons! Henry yelled, though he had nothing to back it up but the sheer chaos of the room. The man in white, having recovered and followed his team up, stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing his gas mask now, but his face was a mask of despair. He looked at the spinning gears, the blue sparks, and the laptop melting into the copper coil. You've killed it. The man whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the clockwork. You've killed the system. The system was a parasite. Professor Aries said, standing tall despite his exhaustion. A building with no foundation eventually falls. You should have checked the load-bearing capacity of the truth. With a final, deafening crack, the main drive gear shattered under the extreme torque. The weights hit the bottom of the shaft with the force of a small earthquake, and the clock stopped dead. The massive hands on the outside of the tower were frozen at exactly 12 seconds past midnight. The silence that followed was heavy. The blue sparks faded, leaving only the smell of smoke and the distant, muffled sound of police sirens. Thousands of them this time, converging on the station from every direction. The news had broken, and the city was waking up. The man in white looked at his empty hands. Without the digital grid, without the secrecy of the Iron Gate, he was just a man in an expensive suit in a dusty room. He didn't try to fight. He simply sat down on a pile of old gear shavings and waited for the end. Henry looked at Elena. Her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes were bright. She reached out and took his hand. "Is it over?" she asked. Henry looked at the frozen gears of the clock. "The journey is over," he said. "But I think we're going to have a lot of explaining to do about the station's clock." The silence in the clock tower didn't last long. The heavy thud of tactical boots on the stairs was replaced by the frantic, echoing shouts of the city police. Blue and red light pulsed through the massive glass faces of the clock, casting rhythmic shadows across the shattered brass gears. Henry, Elena, and the professor stood in the center of the room, their hands raised, as a dozen officers swarmed the attic. "Secure the perimeter." A voice boomed. "Get the medical team up here." The man in white was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit now a crumpled ruin of failure. He didn't look back. As he passed Henry, He murmured something so low only the architect could hear. "Buildings can be rebuilt, Mr. Archer. But some foundations are made of blood." Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the nitrogen fog. He watched as the officers began to bag the remains of the laptop and the melted silver whistle. A detective in a tan trench coat. Detective Miller, the man who had taken Henry's initial statement weeks ago, stepped forward, tipping his hat. "You've caused a hell of a mess, Archer," Miller said, looking at the destroyed clockwork. "But my phone hasn't stopped ringing for 10 minutes. Every major news outlet in the country just received a gift-wrapped confession from the Iron Gate. I assume I have you to thank for that." "It was a collaborative effort," Henry said, nodding toward Elena and the professor. While the police processed the scene, Henry's eyes drifted back to the blueprints Elena had displayed on her laptop before it was destroyed. His mind, trained to see the space between walls, began to itch. He remembered the layout of the underground command center, the way the ventilation ducts converged. Something wasn't right. He walked over to a stack of charred papers that had blown out of the man in white's briefcase during the struggle. Most were financial records, but one was a hand-drawn sketch of the Central Station's foundations. It wasn't a blueprint, it was a redline revision, the kind an architect makes when they find a mistake. Henry knelt down, ignoring the officer who told him to step back. The sketch showed a void space behind the main server vault. On the official blueprints, that space was marked as solid bedrock. But in this sketch, there was a stairwell. A stairwell that led nowhere near the exits they had used. "Elena!" Henry called out. She was being checked by a medic but walked over. "Look at this." The man in white wasn't the designer. He was the manager. He didn't know about the Phase 3 exits. Elena squinted at the sketch. "If there's a stairwell there, someone could have slipped out while we were fighting in the fog. Someone who was watching the whole time." "The shadow architect," Professor Aries added, joining them. "The one who truly understood how to hide a city within a city." Henry looked at the frozen clock hands through the glass. The Iron Gate was falling, but the person who had drawn the lines, the one who knew how to turn a train into a prison and a station into a weapon, was still out there, and according to the sketch, that person's private office was located directly beneath the city's oldest cathedral, 3 blocks away. "Detective Miller," Henry said, standing up with a new fire in his eyes. "The arrest of the man in white is just the beginning. There's one more room we haven't raided." The rain began as they stepped out of the Central Station, a cold, needle-like drizzle that blurred the neon signs of the city. Detective Miller had assigned a tactical team to follow Henry's lead, but the architect insisted on moving quietly. If the shadow architect was as meticulous as Henry feared, a fleet of sirens would only trigger a self-destruct sequence. They reached the St. Jude Cathedral, a Gothic masterpiece of flying buttresses and gargoyles that had watched over the city for 3 centuries. Its limestone walls were blackened by decades of industrial soot, making it look like a charred sentinel. The blueprints for the cathedral don't show any basement deeper than the crypts, Henry explained to Elena and Miller as they stood before the heavy oak doors. But the red line sketch showed a ventilation intake disguised as a decorative rose window on the north transept. Henry led them around the side of the massive building. High above, he spotted it, a small, circular window where the leaded glass didn't catch the light like the others. It wasn't glass. It was a painted metal mesh. "There," Henry whispered. He looked at the ground beneath the window. A heavy stone slab, carved with the image of a fallen anchor, sat slightly unevenly against the foundation. Using a hydraulic jack from Miller's tactical kit, they pried the slab upward. Instead of earth, they found a clean, stainless steel chute. It was a modern insertion into an ancient shell. Henry was the first to slide down, landing in a room that felt entirely different from the sterile command center at the station. This room was warm. It smelled of old parchment and expensive tobacco. The walls were lined with thousands of physical blueprints, rolled into tubes and stored in mahogany cubbies. In the center of the room sat a drafting table, illuminated by a single, green-shaded architect's lamp. "Welcome, Mr. Archer," a voice said. It was soft, cultured, and held a hint of genuine admiration. Sitting in a leather wingback chair was an elderly woman. Her hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and she wore a simple grey dress. On the table before her was a compass, a protractor, and a fresh sheet of vellum. "You're the one," Henry said, stepping closer. "You designed the Silver Arrow. You designed the Iron Gate." "I am Clara Vance," she said, "the mother of the man you just sent to prison. But more importantly, I am the architect of the Silent City. My son was merely the contractor. He lacked the vision to understand that a structure is only as strong as its secrets." Henry looked at the drafting table. She was drawing a new map. It wasn't of the city. It was a map of a maritime shipping route, with hidden underwater habitats marked in red. The Iron Gate wasn't just a bank, was it? Elena asked, her hand resting on her holster. It was a blueprint for a new society. Clara said, her eyes fixed on Henry. One where the load-bearing members are those with the intellect to lead, and the void spaces are where we keep the rest of the world. You have the mind for it, Henry. You saw the lung. You saw the bones. Why destroy something so beautiful? Because a building that hides its purpose from the people who live in it isn't a home. Henry replied, "It's a tomb." Clara sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. She reached for a small, ornate lever on the side of her desk. "Then I suppose it's time for a renovation." The lever moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Deep within the walls of the cathedral's hidden chamber, a series of counterweights shifted. Henry, ever sensitive to the structural breadth of a building, felt the floor tilt by a fraction of a degree. It wasn't a collapse. It was a transition. Renovation requires a clean slate. "Henry," Clara Vance said, her voice remaining eerily calm as a hidden door behind her began to slide open, revealing a narrow elevator car lined with brushed aluminum. "Miller, the desk," Henry shouted. Detective Miller lunged forward, but Clara was faster. She stepped into the elevator and pressed a button. The doors shut just as Miller's shoulder slammed into the metal. From behind the wall, the sound of a high-speed winch echoed. She wasn't going up. She was going deeper, into a secondary escape tunnel that likely led to the river. "She's getting away," Elena cried, running to the drafting table. "Wait," Henry commanded, his eyes darting across the vellum sheet Clara had been working on. He didn't look at the drawings. He looked at the indentations left by her pencil on the pad beneath. She wasn't just drawing maps. Look at the coordinates. He grabbed a stick of graphite from the table and lightly rubbed it over the blank sheet of paper beneath the map. A series of numbers and symbols emerged, the ghost of Clara's true plan. It wasn't a maritime route. It was a sequence of structural frequencies. She's not just escaping. Henry realized, his blood turning to ice. The renovation she mentioned, she's triggered a resonant frequency generator. As an architect, Henry knew the terror of mechanical resonance. If a building is vibrated at its natural frequency, the oscillations build upon themselves until the material, no matter how strong, shatters. Clara hadn't planted bombs. She had turned the cathedral itself into a giant tuning fork. The room began to hum. It was a low, subsonic vibration that Henry felt in his marrow before he heard it. On the drafting table, the compass and protractor began to dance. A hairline fracture appeared in the stone archway above the elevator. "She's going to bring the cathedral down on top of us," Miller said, his hand reaching for his radio. "Dispatch. We need an immediate evacuation of St. Jude's and the surrounding 2 blocks." "The radio won't work," Elena yelled over the growing hum. "The frequency is flooding the airwaves." Henry looked at the ghost numbers again. Clara had calculated the exact point of the cathedral's highest tension, the main pier of the central crossing. If they didn't stop the generator, the massive stone tower would collapse inward, crushing the hidden chamber and everyone in it. The generator is in the void space behind the organ pipes. Henry shouted, recalling the red line sketch. If we can disrupt the cycle, if we can change the building's mass even by a few £100, we can shift the frequency. How? Miller asked, looking at the solid stone walls. Henry looked at the thousands of rolls of blueprints in the mahogany cubbies. Each roll was heavy, high-quality vellum. The papers. We need to jam the resonance dampers in the ventilation ducts with everything in this room. We change the airflow, we change the vibration. They began to move, grabbing armfuls of the iron gate's history and shoving them into the intake vents. The hum grew into a roar, the ancient limestone of the cathedral screaming as it was forced to move in ways it was never designed to. The air in the hidden chamber had become a thick fog of stone dust and disintegrated vellum. Henry, Elena, and Detective Miller worked with a desperation that bypassed exhaustion, their movements fueled by the primal urge to survive. They weren't just moving paper, they were fighting physics. By shoving the thick, heavy rolls of high-quality vellum into the primary intake vents, they were manually altering the acoustics of the void space. As an architect, Henry knew that sound was simply air in motion. By clogging the vents, they were changing the mass and the airflow of the cathedral's lungs. The frequency began to stutter. The pure, bone-shattering note that Claravance had triggered, the one that made the very marrow of their bones vibrate, was becoming a discordant mess of muffled thuds. It's working! Elena screamed over the roar, her voice barely audible over the groaning of the ancient limestone. The vibration is shifting. The sensors are showing a drop in the amplitude. Not enough. Henry replied, wiping grit from his eyes. His hands were raw from the rough edges of the stone and the sharp edges of the blueprints. We've changed the pitch, but the energy is still trapped in the masonry. If we don't kill the source, the spire is still going to come down through the roof. Above them, a heavy mahogany beam cracked. Dust rained down in sheets. The cathedral was an old, proud structure, but its mortar had been baked dry over 3 centuries. It was never meant to endure a structural assault from the inside out. Henry grabbed a heavy iron pry bar and looked toward the north wall. He remembered the red line sketch. Behind the mahogany cubbies, there was a secondary duct, a bypass designed for the organ's massive bellows. If the resonance generator was using the organ pipes as a natural amplifier, that was where they had to strike. Miller, get your men to the organ gallery. Henry commanded. If you see a machine that looks like an oversized tuning fork attached to the pipes, destroy it. Use the fire axes, use your boots, just stop the oscillation. Miller nodded, signaling 2 of his tactical officers. They scrambled up a narrow stone staircase that wound upward into the dark heart of the cathedral. Meanwhile, Henry and Elena stayed in the brain of the facility. Henry began to pull out the very last of the blueprints, the ones Clara had kept closest to her desk. As he moved a stack of records, a small, black ledger fell to the floor. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a diary. Henry, wait. Elena said, her hand stopping his. Look at the cover. The ledger bore a symbol they hadn't seen before, not an arrow, but a compass rose intertwined with a serpent. Below it, a date from 40 years ago. This wasn't part of the Iron Gate project. This was the foundation of everything. The reason Clara had built the silver arrow in the first place. Suddenly, the roar of the resonance stopped. The silence that followed was so abrupt it made Henry's ears ring. From high above in the cathedral, they heard the rhythmic metal being struck by an axe. They got it. Miller's voice crackled over the radio, sounding breathless but triumphant. The generator is down. But Archer, you need to get up here. There's something else. Henry and Elena climbed the spiral stairs, their legs heavy and their lungs burning from the dust of the renovation. They emerged into the organ gallery, a high, vaulted space where the massive pipes of the St. Jude organ stood like the pipes of a giant's pan flute. Detective Miller stood near a twisted mass of chrome and wires that had been bolted directly into the wooden frame of the organ. It looked like a modern heart transplanted into an ancient body. "The generator is dead," Miller said, pointing to the mangled machine. "But look at what it was connected to." Beyond the machine, hidden in the shadows of the organ's deepest pipes, was a secondary console. It wasn't digital. It was a mechanical switchboard connected to a series of pneumatic tubes that ran into the very foundations of the city. "The ledger, Henry," Elena whispered, opening the black book they had found below. "This explains it all. The iron gate wasn't just a bank or a bunker. It was a pressure regulator." As Henry scanned the pages, the true scale of Clara Vance's genius, and her madness, became clear. The city sat on a geological fault line that had been stable for centuries. But the construction of the subways and the central station had created pockets of instability. Clara hadn't just built the Iron Gate to hide money. She had built it to control the Earth itself. She was using the resonance to bleed off the pressure from the fault line. Henry said, his fingers tracing the diagrams in the ledger. The silver arrow was moving through the mountains to test the vibration levels. She wasn't just a criminal. She was the city's self-appointed guardian. But she was doing it by holding the city hostage. If the pressure wasn't released on her schedule, the whole region would suffer an earthquake. "And now that we've stopped the generator," Elena's voice trailed off. A low, deep groan rumbled through the floor. It wasn't the resonance of a machine this time. It was the sound of shifting tectonic plates. By destroying the tuning fork, they had stopped the controlled release of energy. The pressure was now building up, with nowhere to go. "We have to restart it," Henry said, looking at the broken generator. "But not like this. We can't let her control the schedule. We need to find the primary relief vault." According to the ledger, the vault was located at the lowest point of the city's drainage system, a place Henry had already visited. The old Saw Junction. The silver whistle. Henry realized. The frequency wasn't just for a bank vault. It was the specific frequency needed to open the hydraulic gates of the relief vault. "But the whistle is melted," Miller reminded him. Henry looked at the ledger. Clara had written out the frequency in musical notation. She had used the organ to amplify the signal. He looked at the massive pipes. "We don't need the whistle," Henry said, his eyes turning to the organ's keyboard. "We have the world's largest instrument. Elena, can you translate these coordinates into a musical chord?" Elena grabbed the ledger, her mind racing through the physics of sound. If the whistle was a high-pitched F-sharp, and the resonance was a low D, the key to the relief vault must be a minor ninth chord played at maximum volume. "Play it," Henry commanded, "before the city decides to fold itself in half." The air in the organ gallery was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. Elena sat at the massive, four-manual console of the St. Jude organ. Her fingers hovered over the ivory keys, which looked like the teeth of a sleeping giant. Henry stood behind her, his hand resting on the polished mahogany of the casing. Below them, the floor continued to shiver with a deep, subterranean grumble, the Earth's impatient demand for release. "The pressure is spiking," Henry said, glancing at a handheld barometer Miller had pulled from his kit. "The ledger says the relief vault gates will only respond to a sustained, resonant chord. It has to be perfect. Elena, if the frequency is off, we'll just shake the foundations loose without opening the vents." Elena took a deep breath. She wasn't a concert organist, but her understanding of mathematics and acoustics was better than any musician's. She adjusted the stops, pulling out the heavy, wooden knobs labeled diapason. "Borden, and bombard. She needed the deepest, most structural sounds the instrument could produce. I'm calculating the harmonics, she whispered, her eyes scanning the ledger's musical notation. A minor ninth centered on 41.2 Hz. That's the E string of the world. Henry, I'll need to couple the pedals to the great organ to get the air pressure we need. She pressed her feet onto the heavy wooden pedals. A low, soft huff of air escaped the bellows. Now! Henry shouted as a series of tiles cracked on the cathedral floor. Elena slammed her hands onto the keys. The sound wasn't music. It was a physical force. The massive pipes roared, sending a wave of sound through the cathedral that was so powerful it blew the dust off the high-vaulted ceilings in a single cloud. The minor ninth chord didn't just fill the room. It resonated through the stone pillars, traveling down through the foundations and into the very bedrock of the city. Henry felt the vibration change. It was no longer the chaotic, violent shaking of an earthquake. It was a focused, rhythmic pulse. Through the soles of his boots, he could feel the sound waves traveling along the pneumatic lines Clara Vance had installed. They were like a key made of air, turning in a lock made of earth. "Look at the river!" Miller yelled, pointing out a high stained glass window. Through the distorted glass, they saw the Great Canal. A massive plume of white water erupted from the center of the channel, shooting 50 feet into the air. It was followed by a deep, guttural roar of escaping air. The relief vault had opened. The pent-up pressure from the fault line was being bled off into the water and the atmosphere, just as Clara's designs had intended. But this time, it was a public release, not a secret leverage point. The cathedral shook one last time, a final groan of settling stone, and then, silence. The subterranean rumbling stopped. The floor became still. Elena slumped over the keys, her hands trembling. The last echo of the chord faded into the rafters. "We did it," she gasped. "We stopped the quake," Henry said, looking at the ledger. "But the pressure is only part of the problem. Look at the ledger's final page. The relief vault isn't just an air vent. It's an intake for the city's secondary reservoir." And Clara had one more renovation planned for the water supply. Miller's radio crackled. "Miller, this is dispatch. We have reports of a secondary security breach at the water treatment plant. Someone's been seen on the service bridge. It's Clara Vance." The water treatment plant was a brutalist fortress of concrete and iron, situated on a narrow spit of land where the river met the city's primary reservoir. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, slicking the surfaces of the massive settling tanks and making the narrow service bridges look like spiderwebs suspended over a dark abyss. Henry, Elena, and Miller arrived as the facility's emergency sirens began to wail. The primary gate had been bypassed with a professional clean cut through the electronic locks. Clara Vance's signature. "She's heading for the central valve house," Henry said, pointing to a circular tower that rose from the center of the reservoir. "If she opens the secondary intake while the pressure from the relief vault is still stabilizing, she'll flood the lower city's foundations. It's not an earthquake, it's a washout. She's going to liquefy the soil under the central station." They sprinted across the main catwalk. The wind whipped at Henry's coat, and the roar of the water below was a constant, hungry growl. Halfway across the service bridge, they saw her. Clara Vance stood at the railing of the valve house, her grey hair plastered to her skull by the rain. She wasn't running anymore. She was holding a handheld detonator, wired to the manual override of the massive sluice gates. "Stop!" Miller shouted, his weapon drawn but shaking in the wind. "It's over, Clara. The iron gate is public. The fault line is stable. There's nothing left to protect." "You think this was about protection?" Clara's voice was surprisingly strong, carrying over the gale. She looked at Henry, her eyes bright with a feverish clarity. "I built this city's secrets to ensure its survival. If it cannot be controlled, it does not deserve to stand. An architect must know when to scrap a failed design. A city isn't a design, Clara. It's people. Henry yelled, inching forward on the slick metal. Your son. The professor. Elena. We aren't lines on a vellum sheet. You're trying to erase a masterpiece because you lost the pen. Clara looked down at the detonator. The masterpiece was the order I provided. You've brought chaos. Henry. You've let the void spaces fill with the noise of the masses. She stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the maintenance hatch. Henry saw the flaw in her position. The bridge they were on was a cantilevered truss. As an architect, he knew its balance was its strength, but also its weakness. The weight of the 3 men and Elena, combined with the wind load, had put the structure under maximum tension. Clara, look at the bridge. Henry warned. The vibrations from the relief vault. The frequency hasn't fully dissipated. You're standing on the harmonic node. Clara laughed. Then we shall all fall together. She pressed the button. A series of muffled explosions echoed from deep beneath the water. The sluice gates began to grind open, but the sudden rush of thousands of tons of water created a massive water hammer effect. A pressure surge that traveled back up the pipes and slammed into the foundations of the valve house. The bridge buckled. The steel screamed as the rivets sheared off like bullets. Henry lunged forward, not for Clara, but for the manual bypass lever located on the bridge's support pillar. If he could close the intake before the surge reached the city, he could save the foundations. Henry, the bridge is going. Elena screamed. He didn't listen. He threw his weight against the rusted iron lever. It didn't move. He grabbed a piece of fallen rebar and wedged it into the mechanism, using every ounce of his strength as a lever. The intake gate slammed shut just as the bridge beneath Claravance gave way. The central section plummeted into the churning white water of the reservoir. The roar of the reservoir eventually subsided into a rhythmic, haunting slosh against the concrete pylons. The bridge was gone, a jagged skeleton of steel reaching out into the mist. Claravance had vanished into the white foam of the surge, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of her great design. Henry knelt on the remaining section of the catwalk, his hands raw and bleeding from the iron lever. Elena was beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around his shoulders. They stayed that way for a long time, watching the sun begin to bleed through the grey morning clouds, turning the water of the reservoir from black to a bruised, hopeful purple. She's gone, Miller said, his voice weary as he holstered his weapon. He looked back toward the city skyline. The foundations are holding. The engineers say the water hammer stopped just in time. The reckoning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of revelations that shook the country to its core. The Iron Gate wasn't just a scandal. It was a total restructuring of the city's history. The documents. The data Henry and Elena had broadcast from the clock tower led to the arrest of over 400 individuals, ranging from bank presidents to high-ranking city officials. The professor. Professor Aries was awarded the city's Medal of Honor, though he preferred to spend his days in the restored university library, finally wearing a new pair of glasses, though he kept the broken ones on his desk. The architecture. The hidden chambers beneath St. Jude's and the central station were sealed with reinforced concrete, but not before Henry helped the city planners map out the fault line's relief system. The Silent City was no longer a secret leverage point. It was now a public utility. The final blueprint. 1 month later, Henry stood in his old office. The drafting table was clean, save for a single sheet of fresh vellum. He wasn't drawing skyscrapers anymore. He was looking at a set of plans for a low-income housing project that utilized the very void spaces Claravance had once used for her prisons. A soft knock came at the door. Elena walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small, wrapped box. She looked rested, her eyes clear for the first time since they had boarded the Silver Arrow. "Thinking about another renovation?" she asked, leaning against the window frame. A real one this time, Henry said, gesturing to the plans. One where the load-bearing walls are built for people to live behind, not for secrets to hide in. Elena smiled and set the box on the table. I have something for you. The police found it in the debris at the water treatment plant. Henry opened the box. Resting on a bed of velvet was the silver whistle. It was scorched and dented, its internal crystals likely shattered, but the silver still held a faint, defiant glint. It doesn't work anymore, Elena said. The frequency is dead. Henry picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his palm. He thought of the train, the library car, the frozen clock tower, and the woman who thought she could draw the world in grey and white. He thought of the iron heart and the way it had finally been broken. It's better this way, Henry said. A whistle is for calling for help. I think, for the first time in a long time, the city can hear itself just fine. He walked to the window. Below, the city was a tapestry of movement. Commuters rushing to the station, children playing in the parks, the sun reflecting off the glass of 1,000 homes. It was messy, it was loud, and it was unpredictable. To an architect like Clara Vance, it was chaos. To Henry Archer, it was the most beautiful structure he had ever seen. He took the silver whistle and placed it on the corner of his drafting table, next to his compass and his pen. It wasn't a key anymore. It was a reminder that even the strongest steel can bend, and the most hidden door can always be opened, if you have the courage to find the latch. Ready? Elena asked, offering him her hand. Ready, Henry said. They walked out of the office, leaving the blueprints behind to dry. The architect had finally stopped building walls and started building a life.